Before the storm broke, there was only the sound of a slow, sleeping world. It is a morning we can still see if we close our eyes tightly enough, a Sunday drenched in the pale, amber light of a December that had not yet learned how to be cold. In the small towns of the Midwest, the air smelled of wood smoke and dried corn husks. In the cities, it was the scent of fresh newsprint and the low hum of milk trucks rattling over cobblestones. For the young man who would soon become the heart of the Marine Corps, it was a day of simple, unremarkable things. It was a day of sleeping late, of polished shoes, and of the quiet, rhythmic ticking of clocks on mantelpieces that had no idea their time was about to be measured differently. Let us sit for a moment with a boy named Thomas. He is 19, with hands hardened by the plow and a heart that feels a little too big for the quiet hills of his father's farm. To Thomas, the world is as small as the fence line and as wide as the radio dial. He had joined the Marines a few months earlier, not because he went looking for a fight, but because he was looking for a way to see what lay beyond the horizon. He liked the way the blue uniform felt, stiff, proud, and promising a life that wasn't dictated by the harvest. On this particular Sunday morning, Thomas is sitting on his bunk in a barracks far from home, sunlight streaming through a high window, illuminating the dust motes that dance in the air. He is writing a letter. The pen scratches softly against the paper, a rhythmic, comforting sound. He tells his mother about the food, about the way the ocean smells like salt and old pennies, and how he misses the way the wind sounds in the oak trees back home. He doesn't mention fear. Fear hasn't found its way into his vocabulary yet. To him, the Marine Corps is a brotherhood of shared cigarettes and whispered jokes in the dark. It is a place where he has found brothers he never knew he had, boys from the docks of Brooklyn, from the timber woods of Oregon, and from the dusty plains of Texas. In these early hours, the peace is a tangible thing. It is a soft blanket draped over the shoulders of a nation that is tired of the old world's troubles but still believes in the safety of its own shores. At the training camps, the mornings are defined by the call of the bugle, not a harsh command, but a melodic reminder that the day has begun. There is a gentleness to the routine. The folding of blankets, the shining of brass, the shared silence of breakfast. You can almost hear the collective breath of thousands of young men, held in a moment of perfect, fragile stillness. They are dreamers, mostly. They dream of girls back home with ribbons in their hair. They dream of the cars they want to buy and the lives they will build when their hitch is up. They are sons and brothers, neighbors and friends, woven into the fabric of a country that still feels like a neighborhood. There is another young man, perhaps in a different city, standing on a street corner with a newspaper tucked under his arm. Let's call him Robert. He is a city boy, used to the neon lights and the frantic energy of the subway. He joined the Marines because he saw a poster, a man in a dress blue uniform looking out at a sea he had never visited. To Robert, the Corps represented a dignity he hadn't yet found in the concrete canyons of his youth. On this Sunday morning, he is thinking about the girl he met at the dance the night before. He remembers the warmth of her hand and the way she laughed when he stepped on her toes. He wonders if he should call her, or if he should wait. These are the stakes of his world. These are the gentle anxieties of a life at peace. He looks up at the sky, a clear, brilliant blue, and feels a sense of profound belonging. He is part of something now. He is a Marine. And in his mind, that means he is a guardian of this very peace, a sentry at the gates of a world that feels invincible. The quiet of that morning was a special kind of silence. It was the silence of a library, of a church before the service begins, of a nursery where a child is sleeping. It was a silence that held all the possibilities of the future within it, before the future was narrowed down to a single, sharp point. In the barracks at Pearl Harbor, men were heading to the mess hall, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. Some were thinking about the football games they would listen to on the radio later that afternoon. Others were planning a trip to the beach, imagining the cool water of the Pacific against their skin. There was a sense of leisure, a feeling that time was an endless resource. They were young, and when you are young and the sun is shining, it is impossible to believe that the world could ever break. But then, the air changed. It didn't happen all at once. It began as a low vibration, a hum that sat in the back of the throat before it reached the ears. It was a sound that didn't belong to the Sunday morning. It was too heavy, too purposeful. In living rooms across the country, the music on the radio suddenly cut out. There was a moment of static, a dry, crackling sound like dead leaves blowing across a porch. And then, a voice. A voice that was trembling, just a little, breaking the news that the world had been torn open. Imagine the mother in the farmhouse, the one Thomas was writing to. She is standing in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, when the news reaches her. The radio sits on the counter, it's small. Light glowing like a coal. As the words fill the room, the world outside her window stays exactly the same. The oak trees are still there. The wind is still soft. But the room feels colder. She looks at the empty chair where her son used to sit, and the silence of the house suddenly feels heavy, like it is filled with stones. The peace hasn't just been broken, it has vanished, as if it were never there at all. For the young Marines, the transition was a quiet, internal earthquake. There were no grand speeches in those first few minutes. There was only the look in each other's eyes, a sudden, sharp recognition that the games were over. Robert, standing on his city street corner, hears the news from a passerby and feels the world tilt on its axis. The girl from the dance, the car he wanted to buy, the neon lights, they all fade into a distant, blurry background. The uniform he is wearing suddenly feels heavier. It is no longer just a promise of adventure, it is a weight of responsibility that he is not sure he is ready for, but one he knows he must carry. There is a story of a young recruit who was on leave that day, walking through a park with his younger brother. When they heard the news, the boy looked at his older brother in his uniform and saw, for the first time, not a sibling, but a soldier. The young Marine didn't say anything. He just reached out and ruffled his brother's hair, a small, tender gesture of reassurance that was meant as much for himself as it was for the child. It is in these tiny moments, the squeeze of a hand, the steadying of a breath, that the history of the Marine Corps truly lives. It is not found in the grand movements of maps, but in the quiet resolve of a boy deciding that he will be brave, even if his heart is hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As the sun began to set on that Sunday, the amber light turned to a deep, bruised purple. The country was waking up to a new reality, one where the horizon was no longer a place of mystery, but a place of peril. In the barracks, the letters home were finished, but they felt different now. The words seemed smaller, less able to capture the sudden vastness of the world. Thomas, back at his desk, looked at the letter he had written to his mother. He thought about tearing it up, about starting over and telling her how much he loved her, how much he missed the farm. But instead, he just folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. He would mail it tomorrow. It was a piece of the world that had existed only hours ago, a souvenir from a time of peace that was already drifting away like smoke. The first night of the war was a night of long shadows and whispered conversations. Men sat on the edges of their bunks, the darkness of the room amplified by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. They talked about home, not as a place they would return to soon, but as a place they had to protect. They spoke in low tones, their voices barely rising above the sound of the wind. They were finding comfort in the simple presence of one another. The Marine Corps had become their family, and the barracks their only home. There was a profound sense of shared destiny, a quiet understanding that they were all walking into the same dark woods together. In the days that followed, the pace of life changed. The gentle routines were replaced by a sharp, focused energy. The training became more earnest, the movements more precise. But beneath the discipline, the human stories remained. There were the frantic, hurried weddings of young couples who didn't want to wait for a future that wasn't guaranteed. There were the fathers who took their sons fishing one last time, standing in the middle of a cold stream, saying everything they needed to say without speaking a word. There were the young men who spent their last night of leave sitting on the porch with their dogs, just listening to the crickets and trying to memorize the smell of the grass. The Marine Corps is often described as a machine of war, but in these early days, it was a collection of beating hearts. It was thousands of individual lives, each with its own history, its own fears, and its own quiet heroisms. There were boys who had grown up in the shadow of the Great Depression, who knew what it meant to go without, and who understood the value of a job well done. They brought that resilience with them into the service. They didn't see themselves as legends. They saw themselves as men who had a task to perform, and who wanted to do it well enough to get back to the lives they had left behind. As we look back at that first Sunday, let us remember the softness of it. Let us remember the light in the windows and the peace in the streets. Because it was that very peace, the simple, everyday beauty of a world without fear, that those young men were stepping forward to save. They were leaving behind the Sunday mornings of their youth to ensure that Sunday mornings would continue to exist for everyone else. They were the children of a quiet nation, preparing to become the giants of a new age. The journey ahead would be long, and it would be filled with many more nights of uncertainty. There would be jumbles that didn't know the meaning of silence and islands that felt like the end of the world. But for now, as the moon rises over a country that is just beginning to understand its own strength, we can still hear the echoes of that Sunday morning. We can hear the scratching of the pens, the rustle of the newspapers, and the quiet breathing of young men who are dreaming of home. They are the guardians of our memory, the quiet heroes of a story that is only just beginning. Sleep now, and know that even in the darkest night, there is always a light burning in a window somewhere, waiting for the boys to come home. Imagine a tiny speck of coral, lost in a sea so vast that the sky seems to wrap around the water like a velvet ribbon. This is the story of a place called Wake Island, a small, V-shaped atoll that sits alone in the deep, blue heart of the Pacific. To look at it from above is to see a fragile thumbprint of land, barely rising above the waves, surrounded by thousands of miles of restless, rolling ocean. In the late months of a world still clinging to peace, this island was not a fortress. It was a home to birds, to the low whistle of the wind through the brush, and to a few hundred men who felt as though they had reached the very edge of the earth. Among these men was a young Marine we might call Arthur. Arthur was someone who appreciated the silence. Back home in the rolling hills of Virginia, he had known the quiet of the woods before a snowfall, but the silence of Wake Island was something different altogether. It was a heavy, ancient silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic crashing of the surf against the reef. For Arthur and his companions, life on the atoll was a strange blend of salt, sun, and waiting. There were a small group, a few hundred Marines, and a larger group of civilian construction workers, men who had come with hammers and shovels to build runways in the sand. In the evenings, when the tropical heat began to lift, these two groups of men would often sit together, watching the sun dip below the horizon in a riot of orange and violet. There was a shared understanding between them, a quiet bond formed by the simple fact of their isolation. They were the only souls for 1,000 miles, a small gathering of humanity on a stage of coral and sea. When the news of the world breaking apart finally reached them, it didn't come with the roar of a crowd. It came as a crackle of static over a radio, a series of short, sharp sentences that changed the air they breathed. Suddenly, the vastness of the ocean around them didn't feel like a protective barrier anymore. It felt like a great, dark room, and they were a single candle burning in the center of it. Arthur remembered looking out at the horizon that first evening after the news came. The water was as calm as a mirror, reflecting the first few stars of the night. It was hard to believe that somewhere beyond that curve of the earth, the world was in flames. On Wake, there was only the sound of the wind and the feeling of 1,000 miles of water pressing in from every side. The days that followed were a testament to a very quiet kind of bravery. It wasn't the bravery of a grand charge or a shouted command, it was the bravery of staying steady when you knew you were alone. The Marines and the civilian workers became one family. There is a story of a construction worker who, despite having no uniform and no obligation to stay, sat beside a young Marine in a sandy trench. He didn't have a weapon, so he brought a thermos of coffee and a handful of stories about his life back in San Francisco. They sat there in the heat, sharing the coffee and the memories, two men from different worlds finding a common ground in the sand. It is in these small acts of kindness, the offering of a drink, the sharing of a dry biscuit, the steady hand on a shoulder, that the true spirit of the island lived. The isolation of Wake Island was like a physical weight. They watched the sky constantly, hoping to see the silhouettes of their own ships coming to bring them home, or at least to bring them word that they hadn't been forgotten. But the horizon remained empty, a perfect, unbroken line. In the quiet hours of the night, Arthur would often think about his mother's garden. He could almost smell the damp earth and the peonies. He wondered if she was looking at the same moon he was, and if she knew just how lonely the Pacific could be. He wrote letters that he knew might never be mailed, his pencil moving softly over the paper by the light of a dim lantern. He didn't write about the fear or the lack of water. He wrote about the way the goony birds danced on the beach and the way the stars looked so bright that you felt you could reach out and pluck them from the sky. He wanted her to remember the beauty of the place, not the shadow that was falling over it. There was a resilience in those men that mirrored the coral they stood upon. Coral is a delicate thing, yet it builds islands that can withstand the fiercest storms. The men of Wake were like that. They moved through the heat and the dust with a calm purpose. When the clouds gathered and the rain began to fall, they didn't see it as a hardship, they saw it as a gift. They would stand out in the downpour with their faces turned upward, letting the cool water wash away the salt and the fatigue. In those moments, they weren't soldiers or laborers, they were just men, grateful for the simple mercy of a cool breeze and a clean drink. As the siege of their tiny home continued, the world began to talk about them. Far away, in living rooms filled with the scent of pine needles and the glow of Christmas lights, people listened to the radio and whispered the name of the island. Wake became a symbol of a flickering flame that refused to go out. But on the island itself, the men didn't feel like symbols. They felt tired and thirsty and very, very small. They were running low on everything but courage. Yet, even as their resources dwindled, their care for one another grew. There are accounts of Marines giving up their last rations to the civilian workers who were helping them dig, and of those same workers staying out in the open to repair what had been broken, moved by a sense of duty that transcended any contract. There was one afternoon when the air was particularly still, and the heat seemed to shimmer off the white sand like a physical presence. Arthur found himself sitting in the shade of a damaged wing of a plane, talking to a man who had been a carpenter before the war. The carpenter was carving a small figure out of a piece of driftwood, a bird with its wings spread wide. He told Arthur that he was making it for his daughter, so he could show her what the birds on Wake looked like when he finally got home. He spoke with such certainty, such a gentle belief in the future, that Arthur felt the tightness in his own chest loosen. It was a moment of profound peace in the midst of an impossible situation. They weren't talking about the enemy or the odds, they were talking about a father's love and a daughter's smile. The end of the struggle on Wake Island didn't come with a flourish. It came with a heavy, solemn realization that they had done all that human beings could do. When the time came to lay down their tools and their pride, it was done with a quiet dignity. There is a story of the men gathering together one last time on the beach. They looked out at the ocean that had been their only companion for so long. The water was a brilliant, sparkling turquoise, and the sand was as white as bone. They were leaving behind more than just a piece of land, they were leaving behind the boys they had been when they arrived. They were walking into a long, uncertain darkness, but they were doing it together. As they were led away from their lonely shore, a few of the men looked back. The island was still there, a tiny green and white jewel in the vastness of the blue. The goony birds were still dancing, and the wind was still whistling through the scrub. The island didn't care about the war, it only knew the tides and the sun. But for the men who had held it, Wake would always be a part of their souls. It was the place where they had learned the true meaning of enough. They had found that when everything else was stripped away, home, safety, the hope of rescue, what remained was the person standing next to you. The story of Wake Island is often told as a tragedy, but in the quiet of a late night, we can see it as something else. It is a story of how a small group of people can turn a desolate strip of sand into a cathedral of the human spirit. It is a reminder that no one is truly alone if they have a friend to share a cup of water with, or a story to tell in the dark. The loneliest shore was not so lonely after all, because it was filled with the warmth of shared courage and the gentle light of human kindness. Now, the island belongs once again to the birds and the wind. The scars in the sand have long since been smoothed over by the tides. But if you listen closely to the sound of the waves, you can almost hear the echoes of those voices, the scratch of a pencil on paper, the low murmur of a story told in a trench, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of men who knew that even in the heart of a great darkness, a single candle can still light the way. Sleep now, and let the memory of that quiet strength carry you into your own dreams, knowing that even the smallest flame is never truly lost in the night. There is a peculiar kind of silence that exists only between the last star of the night and the first light of a day that will change everything. On this morning, off the coast of an island few had ever heard of, the ocean was a palette of bruised silver and soft charcoal. The great ships sat heavy and silent on the swells, their steel hulls whispering against the moving water. For the young men standing on those decks, the world had narrowed down to the few feet of wood and metal beneath their boots and the dark, jagged smudge of land waiting on the horizon. This was the beginning of a journey into the unknown, a first step onto a shore that would soon be known as Guadalcanal, but for now, it was simply the island, a mystery wrapped in mist and the low, rhythmic hum of the sea. Among them was a young man named Leo. He was barely 20, with a face that still held the soft edges of boyhood and hands that were more accustomed to the cold, clear mornings of a Nebraska farm than the heavy, salt-laden air of the South Pacific. As he stood at the railing, Leo felt the weight of his pack, not just the physical burden of his gear, but the weight of all the things he had left behind. In the small pocket over his heart, he carried a photograph of his sister on her graduation day and a silver dollar his father had given him at the train station. These were his anchors, the tiny threads that connected him to a world that felt increasingly like a dream. He watched the white foam curl away from the ship's side, thinking of how the creek back home looked when the spring thaws came. It was a quiet, private meditation, a way to steady his breathing as the order came to move. The transition from the ship to the smaller landing boats was a slow, rhythmic dance of shadows. There were no bright lights, only the pale, filtered glow of the pre-dawn sky. The men climbed down the heavy cargo nets, their fingers gripping the rough hemp as the boats below rose and fell on the waves like breathing chests. There was a strange, communal gentleness in the way they helped one another, a hand reaching out to steady a pack, a whispered word of encouragement, a shared look that said, "I am here with you." In these moments, the grand scale of history vanished. There was only the person to your left and the person to your right, and the collective heartbeat of 100 men held in the same suspended breath. As the small boats turned toward the shore, the silence of the morning was replaced by the low, steady thrum of engines. The water began to change color, turning from a deep, bottomless indigo to a bright, translucent turquoise as the coral reefs rose up to meet them. And then, there was the smell. Long before they touched the sand, the island reached out to them with a scent that was thick, sweet, and ancient. It was the smell of damp earth, of rotting leaves, and of flowers that bloomed and died in a single night. To Leo, it felt as though he was entering a different world entirely, a place where the air was a physical presence, warm and heavy like a wet wool blanket draped over his shoulders. The moment the ramp dropped was not an explosion of sound, but a sudden, jarring encounter with the elements. The water was warmer than Leo expected, a startling contrast to the cool spray of the ocean. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the soft, dark sand of the beach. It was a strange sensation, to finally stand on solid ground after weeks at sea. He looked down and saw his own footprints, the first marks he had made on this new world. They were deep and clear, filling slowly with seawater as the tide came in. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability. On the ship, there were walls and steel. Here, there was only the open sky and the towering green wall of the jungle, watching them with 1,000 hidden eyes. As the morning sun climbed higher, the heat began to truly settle in. It was a sun that didn't just shine, it pressed. It pulled the moisture from their skin and made the very air shimmer with a hazy, golden light. The Marines moved inland, leaving the bright clarity of the beach for the deep, emerald shadows of the coconut groves. The transition was like walking into a cathedral of leaves. The light filtered down through the high fronds and long, dusty shafts, illuminating the brilliant red of a tropical bird or the iridescent blue of a butterfly the size of a man's hand. For a few brief moments, the beauty of the place was overwhelming. It was easy to forget, in the quiet rustle of the palms, that they were there for anything other than a walk through a strange and beautiful garden. Leo found himself walking beside a man named Silas, who was older and had a quiet, steady way about him. Silas had been a carpenter in Pennsylvania, and even here, in the middle of a tropical wilderness, he looked at the trees with a professional eye, noting the strength of the wood and the way the branches grew. When they stopped to rest, Silas reached into his pack and pulled out a small, wooden whistle he had been carving during the long voyage. He handed it to Leo with a tired smile. "For when we get back," he whispered. "Something to remember the quiet by." It was a small moment of humanity, a tiny spark of kindness that made the vastness of the island feel a little less intimidating. They sat there for a piece of time, two men in green uniforms, listening to the strange, mechanical whirring of insects that sounded like distant machinery. The green hell, as some would later call it, began to reveal its true nature as the day wore on. The ground beneath the trees was a tangle of roots and vines that seemed to reach out and trip the unwary. The mud was thick and black, clinging to their boots with a stubborn, silent strength. But even in the struggle, there was a sense of shared resilience. When a man slipped, there was always an arm there to catch him. When a canteen ran dry, a neighbor offered a sip of his own. They were learning the language of the island together, the way the shadows moved, the way the wind changed before a rainstorm, the way the jungle breathed in the heat of the afternoon. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the men were exhausted, their bodies aching with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. They began to dig in for the night, creating small, shallow homes in the earth. The transition to darkness on Guadalcanal was sudden and absolute. There was no long, lingering twilight. The sun simply dropped away, and the world was plunged into a deep, velvet blackness. And with the darkness came the sounds. The jungle, which had been relatively quiet during the heat of the day, suddenly woke up. There were shrieks and whistles, the clicking of mandibles, and the low, guttural croak of frogs. It was a symphony of the unknown, a wall of sound that seemed to press in on the small perimeter of the Marines. Leo lay in his shallow trench, looking up at the small patches of sky he could see through the canopy. The stars were different here, stranger, brighter, arranged in patterns he didn't recognize. He felt small, smaller than he had ever felt in the wide-open fields of Nebraska. He reached out and felt the cool, damp earth beneath his fingers. He thought of his mother, probably clearing the dinner table right about now, and his father, sitting on the porch watching the fireflies. He wondered if they were thinking of him, and if they could feel the prayer he was sending across the thousands of miles of ocean. The first night on the island was a lesson in patience and the power of the imagination. Every rustle of a leaf, every falling coconut, every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep. The men lay still, their eyes straining to see through a darkness so thick you could almost feel it on your skin. They learned to communicate in whispers and touches, a hand on a shoulder to say "I'm awake," a soft pat on the arm to say "you're okay." They were becoming part of the island's rhythm, learning to distinguish the natural sounds of the night from the things that didn't belong. In the middle of the night, a soft rain began to fall. It wasn't the cold, biting rain of the plains, but a warm, gentle mist that felt like a blessing on their fevered skin. Leo closed his eyes and let the water wash over his face. For a moment, the fear and the uncertainty drifted away, replaced by the simple, sensory reality of the rain. It was a reminder that even in this strange and distant place, the world still functioned with a certain grace. The rain would wash away the sweat and the dust, it would feed the thirsty roots of the trees, and it would eventually smooth over the footprints they had left in the sand. As the first gray light of the second day began to seep through the trees, the men rose from their trenches, stiff and damp but still there. They looked at each other with a new kind of understanding. They had survived the first day and the first night. They had taken their first steps into the unknown and found that they could stand. The island was still a mystery, and the path ahead was still hidden in the mist, but they were no longer just boys from the Midwest or the East Coast. There was something else now. They were part of the island, and the island was becoming part of them. The footprints they had left on the beach were gone now, claimed by the rising tide and the shifting sands. But the marks they were making on each other's lives, the shared whistles, the offered water, the steadying hands, those were permanent. As they prepared to move further into the green heart of the island, they carried those moments with them like hidden treasures. They were the architects of a new kind of history, one built not on maps and dates, but on the quiet, enduring strength of the human spirit. And as the birds began their morning chorus, Leo took his first step of the second day, moving forward with a heart that was a little more certain, a little more ready for whatever the horizon had in store. When the sun falls below the canopy, the world does not go to sleep, it simply changes its language. In the deep, emerald heart of the islands, night does not arrive with a gentle fading of the light, but rather with a sudden, heavy velvet curtain that drops without warning. For the young Marines huddled in the earth, the darkness is not merely an absence of sight, it is a living, breathing thing that presses against the skin and fills the lungs. It is here, in the shallow cradles of the foxholes, that the true history of the spirit is written, not in the roar of the day, but in the long, silver hours of the midnight watch. Imagine a young man named Charlie. He is 20 years old, and before this journey began, the darkest night he had ever known was a moonless evening on his grandfather's porch in Ohio. But here, beneath the ancient trees of the Pacific, the darkness is absolute. It is a thick, ink-black soup that makes it impossible to tell where the hand ends and the air begins. Charlie sits in a small hole dug into the damp soil, his back against the cool earth. Beside him is Henry, a boy he met on a troop ship 3 months ago. They do not speak. In the midnight watch, silence is the most precious thing they own. It is a shared blanket, a pact made in the shadows to keep the world outside at bay. The jungle at night is a symphony of the strange and the small. There is the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of insects that sounds like 1,000 tiny typewriters working in the dark. There is the sudden, startling thud of a falling coconut, which in the stillness sounds like a heartbeat skipping. There is the rustle of land crabs moving across the dry leaves, their shells clacking softly like old bones. To a boy like Charlie, every sound is a question that needs an answer. Is that the wind moving through the fronds, or is it something else? Is that the drip of rainwater from a leaf, or a footfall? In the beginning, the mind plays tricks. It takes the shadows and carves them into shapes. It takes the silence and fills it with whispers. But as the hours stretch on, Charlie learns to breathe with the jungle. He learns the difference between the island's natural breath and the things that do not belong. Time moves differently in a foxhole. It does not march in minutes and seconds, it flows like thick honey. In the quiet, Charlie's mind wanders back across the thousands of miles of salt water. He finds himself walking through the rooms of his childhood home. He can see the way the light used to hit the kitchen table at breakfast. He can hear the low murmur of his mother's voice as she hums a tune while hanging laundry. These memories are not just thoughts, they are sanctuary. He clings to them with a quiet intensity, using the warmth of a distant sun to ward off the damp chill of the tropical night. He thinks of a letter he received weeks ago. The paper was soft and smelled of a perfume he remembered from a high school dance. He can still feel the weight of those words in his pocket, a tiny, paper anchor holding him to a world that still makes sense. Next to him, Henry shifts slightly. It is a tiny movement, the brush of a sleeve against a coat, but in the midnight watch, it is an intimate conversation. It says, "I am here." It says, "You are not alone." There is a profound, wordless kindness in this shared vigil. Earlier that evening, Henry had shared a small piece of chocolate he'd been saving in his pack. It was soft and a little gritty, but the sweetness had felt like a miracle on Charlie's tongue. They didn't talk about it, they just broke the square in half and ate it in the fading light, a small communion before the shadows took over. This is the everyday heroism that no map can capture, the simple act of being present for another person in the dark. The psychological landscape of the night is a place of deep reflection. Away from the noise and the duty of the day, these young men are left with their own hearts. They grapple with a fear that is not sharp or sudden, but long and hollow. It is the fear of being forgotten, the fear of the vastness of the ocean, and the quiet, private worry about who they will be when the sun finally rises. Yet, within that fear, there is a remarkable resilience. It is a resilience found in the steadying of a breath, in the firm grip on a familiar object, and in the quiet resolve to simply stay awake for the person sleeping 3 feet away. Charlie watches the stars through the gaps in the towering canopy. They look different here, colder, brighter, and arranged in patterns that have no names in his Nebraska vocabulary. They seem so far away, yet they are the only things that feel permanent in a world of shifting mud and moving shadows. He thinks about how many other boys are looking up at those same stars from their own patches of earth, all of them connected by this invisible thread of waiting. The Midnight Watch is a global brotherhood of the lonely, a vast network of young men holding their breath until the dawn. There are moments when the silence feels too heavy to bear. In those times, Charlie reaches out and touches the edge of Henry's boot with his own. It is a tiny gesture, almost accidental, but Henry responds with a soft, rhythmic tap back. No words are needed. In the language of the foxhole, this is a symphony of reassurance. It is a way of saying that the darkness has not won. They are still here. They are still men. They are still friends. They find strength in the small things, a shared canteen, a dry pair of socks passed in secret, the memory of a joke told yesterday. These are the threads that weave a safety net over the abyss. As the night reaches its deepest point, the air turns cold and a light mist begins to swirl between the trunks of the banyan trees. The jungle seems to sigh, a long, low sound of wind and moisture. Charlie feels a sudden, sharp pang of homesickness, a longing so physical it feels like a bruise. He misses the sound of a dog barking in the distance. He misses the feeling of a clean sheet. He misses the certainty of tomorrow. But then, he hears the steady, rhythmic breathing of the men in the nearby holes, and he realizes that he is part of something larger than his own longing. He is a sentry for their dreams. He is the one holding the candle in the wind. The quiet bravery of the Midnight Watch is often overlooked. It is not the bravery of the charge, but the bravery of the stay. It is the endurance of the mind against the weight of the unknown. It is the ability to sit in the stillness and not be consumed by it. Charlie learns that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. For him, in this moment, the most important thing in the world is the quiet safety of Henry, and the boys in the next hole, and the promise of the first light. And then, slowly, the world begins to change. The ink-black sky softens into a deep, bruised purple. The stars begin to pale, retreating into the growing light. The heavy silence of the night is broken by the first, tentative chirp of a bird, a sound so normal, so mundane, that it feels like a victory. The mist starts to lift from the floor of the jungle, revealing the familiar shapes of roots and gear. The midnight watch is ending. Charlie looks over at Henry, whose eyes are now visible in the pre-dawn gloom. They share a small, tired smile. Their faces are smeared with the dark soil of the island, and their eyes are rimmed with the red fatigue of the sleepless, but they have made it. They have crossed the long, dark bridge of the night together. There is a sense of profound relief, a loosening of the tension that has held their shoulders tight for hours. The day will bring its own challenges, its own heat, and its own struggles, but for now, there is the gift of the morning. The first rays of the sun begin to filter through the leaves, turning the mist into pillars of gold. The jungle smells of whetstone and new growth. Charlie reaches into his pocket and touches the letter one last time before standing up to stretch his aching limbs. The footprints of the night, the private fears, the whispered prayers, the long thoughts of home, will stay here, buried in the dark soil of the island. But the strength they found in the shadows will go with them. As the camp begins to stir, with the low murmur of voices and the clinking of metal, the memory of the midnight watch lingers like a dream. It is a reminder that even in the most absolute darkness, there is a light that comes from within. It is the light of companionship, the light of memory, and the quiet, unyielding flame of the human spirit. Sleep now, and know that even when the night seems longest, you are never truly alone. There is always someone on the watch, holding the silence for you, waiting for the sun to find its way back to the world. The pencil lead meets the paper with a sound so soft it is almost a secret, a gentle scratch that carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers. After months where the world was made of thunder and the heavy, humid breath of the jungle, the stillness of this new place feels like a miracle. The first campaign has sighed to a close, and for the young men who have stepped out of the shadows and back into the light, the most important weapon they carry is no longer made of steel. It is a stub of a pencil, chewed at the end, and a piece of paper so crumpled and worn it feels like linen. Here, in the quiet shade of a resting camp far from the mud of the islands, a boy named William is trying to find the words to tell his family that he is still the person they remember. William sits on the edge of a cot, his boots finally dry, his skin scrubbed clean of the salt and the grit that had become a second skin. Around him, the camp is a cathedral of hushed activity. There are no shouted orders here, no whistles blowing in the dark. Instead, there is the low, melodic murmur of men who are learning how to be quiet again. Some are sleeping, their faces smooth and untroubled in the afternoon sun. Others are sitting in pairs, sharing a single orange as if it were a king's ransom, the bright citrus scent cutting through the dusty air. But most of them are doing what William is doing. They are writing. They are leaning over crates, over knees, over folded blankets, their brows furrowed in deep concentration as they reach across the ocean with their pens. For William, the act of writing is a slow, meditative process. He stares at the blank page for a long time before the first word appears. How do you describe the color of the Pacific to someone who has only ever seen the gray-green of a Nebraska pond? How do you explain the way the wind sounds in the palm fronds without mentioning the fear that used to ride upon it? He decides, with a soft smile, that he won't try. He begins with the small things, the things that keep him anchored to the earth. He writes about the taste of the fresh water they were given this morning, how it felt cold and sharp in the back of his throat, like a drink from the well behind the barn. He writes about a dog he saw wandering through the camp, a scruffy, friendly creature that reminded him of the hound he used to hunt with when he was 12. The paper he writes on has traveled a long way to find him. It has been tucked in his pocket through rainstorms and river crossings, folded and refolded until the creases are white and soft. To William, this paper is more than just a surface for ink, it is a physical bridge. When he touches it, he imagines his mother touching the other side of it in a few weeks' time. He imagines her standing by the mailbox at the end of the long dirt drive, the cicadas buzzing in the summer heat, as she pulls this very sheet from its envelope. This thought makes him press the pencil a little harder, as if he could leave a thumbprint of his soul on the page for her to find. There is a quiet resilience in this letter writing. It is an act of defiance against the vastness of the war. In a world that feels as though it has grown too large and too loud, these letters narrow everything back down to the human scale. They are about birthdays missed and gardens planted. They are about the hope of a harvest and the memory of a favorite pie. William watches a friend of his, a boy named Thomas from the docks of Boston, struggling with his own letter. Thomas isn't a man of many words, and his handwriting is large and shaky, but he spends hours on a single paragraph. He is writing to a younger brother, telling him to stay in school and to take care of their mother's knees when the damp weather comes. It is a quiet kind of heroism, this looking forward, this refusal to let the present moment erase the future. In the camp, there is a shared understanding of the sanctity of the mail. The mail call is the heartbeat of the Marine Corps, the moment when the outside world breaks through the perimeter. But the sending of the mail is just as vital. It is the exhaling of the spirit. As William writes, he feels the tension leaving his shoulders, the tightness in his chest beginning to unfurl. The memories of the long nights in the foxholes, the sounds of the midnight watch that used to haunt his sleep, seem to retreat into the background. They are replaced by the rhythm of his own sentences. He tells his father about the way the light hits the mountains here, how it turns them a soft, dusty blue that reminds him of the smoke from a wood stove. He mentions a book he found, a salt-stained mystery novel that has been passed through 20 hands until the pages are translucent. He tells them he is reading again. He tells them he is okay. Kindness moves through the camp like a gentle breeze. A man wanders by and drops a spare stamp on William's knee without saying a word. Another offers a sharp knife to point his pencil. These are the small, everyday mercies that define the life of a Marine during the time of rest. There is no rank in these moments, only a collective gentleness. They are all sons, all brothers, all dreamers. They share the same ink, the same envelopes, and the same longing for a world that doesn't smell of diesel and damp earth. William pauses for a moment, looking out toward the horizon. The ocean is calm today, a vast sheet of silk that reflects the pale blue of the sky. It looks so peaceful that it's hard to remember it as the same water that carried them to the loneliest shore. He thinks about the voyage the letter will take. It will sit in a dark bag on a ship, then an airplane, traveling over thousands of miles of empty blue. It will pass through dozens of hands, sorted by people who will never know his face but who understand the importance of his words. It is a tiny, fragile thing, a few scraps of paper and a bit of lead, and yet it is strong enough to cross the world and heal a heart. He finds himself writing about the dreams he has had lately. Not the dreams of the island, but the dreams of the after. He writes about a porch swing that needs fixing and a fence that needs a new coat of paint. He writes about the silence of a Sunday afternoon at home, the kind of silence that doesn't have to be listened to, only enjoyed. He realizes, as the pencil moves, that he is no longer the same boy who left that farm. The island has changed him, carved away the soft parts and left something harder, something more enduring. But the letter shows him that the core of who he is remains untouched. He still loves the smell of rain on dry earth. He still remembers the way his sister laughed at his jokes. He still believes in the goodness of a simple life. As the sun begins to set, casting long, golden shadows across the camp, William reaches the end of his page. He signs his name, not his rank, not his serial number, just Will. He folds the paper carefully, matching the old creases, and slips it into the envelope. He licks the glue, the taste bitter and familiar, and presses it shut with the heel of his hand. It feels like a finished task, a mission accomplished that is more satisfying than any patrol. He stands up and stretches, feeling the warmth of the fading sun on his back. He walks toward the center of the camp where the mailbag sits, a heavy canvas sack that is already bulging with the hopes and memories of 1,000 other men. He drops his letter inside, hearing it thud softly against the others. For a moment, he keeps his hand on the bag, a silent goodbye to the words he has just sent. He knows that when his mother reads that letter, she will breathe a sigh of relief. She will see the smudge of lead on the corner and the way he looped his L's, and she will know that her son is still there, somewhere beneath the green uniform and the tan of the Pacific sun. This is the true rhythm of the war, not just the movement of ships and the strategy of generals, but the ebb and flow of these paper messages. It is a conversation held in whispers across an ocean. As the stars begin to appear, the same stars that looked so cold during the midnight watch, they now seem a little friendlier. They are the same stars that will guide his letter home. William walks back to his cot, his heart feeling a little lighter, his mind a little clearer. The first campaign is over, and though he knows there are more islands ahead, more shadows to walk through, he has found his way back to himself. He has reclaimed his story, one pencil stroke at a time. The silence of the camp is no longer a heavy thing, it is a resting thing, a space where the soul can catch its breath before the next tide comes in. Sleep now, and imagine that paper bridge. Imagine the letters moving across the dark water like tiny white birds, carrying the light of 1,000 homes into the heart of the sea. Know that no matter how far a person wanders, as long as they can find a pencil and a scrap of paper, they are never truly lost. They are always just one letter away from the people they love. The night is soft, the ocean is wide, and the words are on their way. The island did not speak in whispers, it spoke in the rhythmic, unending drumming of water against leaves. On Bougainville, the world was no longer made of solid earth and clear horizons. It had become a place of liquid shadows, a realm where the sky and the ground seemed to melt into one another under the weight of a deluge that never truly ended. For the young Marines who lived within this emerald twilight, the greatest struggle was not always found in the sudden flash of a conflict, but in the slow, patient endurance of the damp. Here, the jungle breathed, a heavy, humid breath that smelled of ancient ferns, wet stone, and the sweet, cloying scent of life and decay tangled together in the heat. Consider a young man named Daniel. Before the war, Daniel had known the rains of the Pacific Northwest, the kind that misted the pine trees and made the world smell of fresh resin. But the rain on Bougainville was a different creature entirely. It was thick, warm, and relentless. It didn't just fall, it occupied the space around you. It found its way into every crease of a uniform, every seam of a boot, and every corner of the mind. Daniel sat in a shallow trench that had long ago become a small, private pond. He didn't fight the water anymore. He had learned, as they all had, to simply exist within it. He watched a single, silver bead of rain roll down the length of a broad leaf, hanging for a heartbeat at the tip before dropping into the dark pool at his feet. In that tiny motion, he found a strange, hypnotic peace. It was a small clock, ticking away the hours of the afternoon in a world where time had lost its meaning. In this place, the mud was a character in their lives. It was a deep, chocolate-colored tide that swallowed boots and bogged down the soul. To take a single step was an act of will, a slow tug-of-war with the earth itself. The Marines moved through it with a heavy, rhythmic gait, their shoulders hunched against the downpour. There was a quiet, shared comedy in the way they moved, a hand reaching out to catch a slipping comrade, a silent nod when a boot was pulled free with a wet, sucking sound. These were the moments where the bond of the Corps became a physical thing. It wasn't about the grand movements of armies, it was about the man next to you, whose face was just as smeared with the dark earth as your own, and whose steady presence was the only thing keeping the world from sliding away. One afternoon, during a brief pause in the heaviest part of the rain, Daniel found himself sitting beneath a makeshift shelter of palm fronds with a boy named Elias. Elias was from a small town in Georgia, a place he described as having red clay and white porches. They didn't talk about the maps or the hills they had to climb. Instead, they talked about the sensation of being dry. They spoke of the smell of sun-warmed sheets and the feeling of dust between their toes on a hot summer road. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metal tin. Inside was a single, dry cigarette he had been saving for a week, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth to protect it from the damp. He broke it in half with the precision of a diamond cutter and handed the other piece to Daniel. They sat there in the humid gloom, the tiny sparks of orange light the only warmth in their world. It was a shared luxury, a quiet act of kindness that felt more significant than any medal. In the heavy breath of the jungle, that small shared smoke was a declaration that they were still human, still capable of grace. The psychology of Bougainville was one of profound isolation. The canopy was so thick that the sun was often just a pale, ghostly glow somewhere far above the layers of green. It felt as though they were living at the bottom of a deep, watery well. The sounds were magnified. The sudden crack of a falling branch sounded like a thunderclap, and the evening chorus of the frogs was a wall of noise that vibrated in the chest. Daniel would often lie awake during his watch, listening to the jungle. He began to hear the music in it, the different pitches of the rain hitting different types of leaves, the low bass of the wind moving through the banyan roots. He realized that the jungle wasn't his enemy, it was simply indifferent. It was an ancient, breathing entity that had been there long before him and would remain long after. This realization brought a peculiar comfort. He was a small part of a very large and very old story. Everyday heroism on the island was often found in the most mundane tasks. It was the man who volunteered to fetch the water canteens, slipping and sliding his way to the stream so his friends could rest their aching legs. It was the corpseman who spent hours in the mud, tenderly treating the jumble rot on a boy's feet, speaking in low, reassuring tones as if he were a mother tending to a child's scraped knee. It was the way a letter from home, though blurred by moisture and softened into a pulp, would be passed around and read aloud in whispers, the words of a distant sister or sweetheart becoming a shared treasure for the whole squad. These letters were the only things that didn't smell of the swamp. They smelled of cedar, of lavender, and of the dry, sweet air of a world that felt like a beautiful dream. Daniel had a letter of his own, tucked into the liner of his helmet. It was from his father, a man of few words who had spent his life working the soil. The letter didn't say much, it spoke of the health of the horses and the price of grain. But in the margin, his father had pressed a small, dried wildflower. By the time it reached Daniel on Bougainville, the flower had crumbled into a few yellow specks, but to Daniel, those specks were a golden light. He would touch them with the tip of his finger when the rain felt too heavy to bear. They were a reminder that there was a place where the sun still shone, where the earth stayed where you put it, and where the air was light and clear. The resilience found in the mud of Bougainville was not a loud or boisterous thing. It was a quiet, stubborn flame. It was the refusal to let the dampness reach the heart. The men found ways to maintain their dignity in the midst of the mire. They would shave with cold water and a dull blade, using a small, cracked mirror hung from a vine, just to see a face they recognized beneath the grime. They would mend their torn uniforms with bits of vine or wire, a small rebellion against the decay of the tropics. They were creating a home out of the inhospitable, a community of the sodden and the brave. As the weeks turned into months, the heavy breath of the jungle became a familiar rhythm. The Marines learned the signs of the island, the way the birds would go silent before a storm, the way the light would turn a strange, electric yellow in the moments before the clouds broke. They became part of the landscape. Daniel noticed that his own skin had taken on the tint of the environment, a weathered, earthy tan that made him feel as though he belonged to the trees. There was a strange beauty in this merging. At night, when the fireflies emerged, vast clouds of them that pulsed in unison, the jungle transformed into a shimmering, magical cathedral. For a few hours, the mud and the rot were forgotten, replaced by a light so soft and pure it felt like a prayer. The endurance of these men was a testament to the power of the human spirit to find meaning in the most difficult of circumstances. They were not just surviving the rain, they were mastering it. They were learning that strength is not found in the absence of hardship, but in the ability to carry it with a steady hand. Daniel would look at his companions, their eyes tired, their shoulders heavy, but their spirits unyielding, and feel a sense of profound pride. They were the architects of a quiet victory, one measured in inches of mud and hours of patience. When the time finally came to leave the island, the departure was as quiet as the arrival. As Daniel stood on the deck of the ship, looking back at the dark, jagged silhouette of Bougainville disappearing into the mist, he felt a strange pang of loss. He was leaving a part of himself behind in that mud, a younger, softer version of the boy who had first stepped onto the shore. But he was carrying something new away with him. He was carrying the knowledge that he could endure the unendurable. He had breathed the heavy breath of the jungle and had not been smothered by it. The rain was still falling on the island as the ship pulled away, a silver curtain closing on a chapter of his life. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt the sun on his face. It was a pale, thin light, but it was real. He reached into his pocket and felt the crumbled yellow specks of his father's flower. The world was still wide, and there were more horizons to meet, but the lessons of the mud would stay with him forever. He had learned that even in the deepest swamp, a man can still find a way to stand tall. He had learned that kindness is the only thing that doesn't rot, and that the heaviest breath of all is the one you take just before you decide to keep going. Sleep now, and let the sound of the rain be a lullaby. Imagine the fireflies in the dark, pulsing like the heart of the world. Know that no matter how deep the mud or how heavy the sky, there is a quiet strength within you that can weather any storm. The jungle is at rest, the stars are watching, and the morning will find you ready, rooted like the ancient trees, waiting for the light to return. The ocean has a way of hiding its secrets beneath a surface of shimmering turquoise, until the moment it asks you to walk upon the bones of the sea. There is a tiny atoll in the middle of the vast, sun-drenched Pacific, a place where the water is so clear it looks like liquid glass, and the sand is as white as a brand new sheet. On a morning that began with a deceptive, golden calm, this place, called Tarawa, became a stage for a different kind of story, not one of grand maneuvers or cold statistics, but a story of the human heart finding its way across a jagged, coral edge. For the young Marines waiting in the shallow boats, the world had shrunk to the width of a wooden plank and the sound of their own breath, rhythmic and soft, echoing against the metallic hum of the engine. Imagine a young man named Elias. He is 21 years old, with eyes that still carry the reflected green of the rolling hills of Tennessee. Back home, Elias was known for his ability to whistle a tune so clearly that the birds would stop to listen. He was a boy who loved the feeling of cool creek water on a summer afternoon and the smell of cedar shavings in his father's workshop. As he sat in the landing craft, his knees pulled up toward his chest, he wasn't thinking about maps or the strategic importance of a tiny strip of land. He was thinking about the way his mother used to tuck the corners of his quilt in at night, making him feel safe and small in a world that was suddenly far too large. He reached into his pocket and felt a small, smooth stone he had picked up in the driveway the day he left. It was warm from his touch, a tiny piece of home that felt heavier than all the gear he carried. When the boats reached the edge of the reef, the tide did something unexpected. It pulled away, leaving the water shallow and the shore frustratingly far. The transition from the boat to the sea was not a leap, but a slow, hesitant descent. As Elias stepped over the side, the water rose up to meet his waist, warm and salt-heavy. Beneath his boots, he felt the coral. It was not like the soft sand of the Tennessee Creek. It was sharp, ancient, and unforgiving. It was the cruel edge of the island's defense, a jagged floor of stone that seemed to want to hold them back. In that moment, the isolation was absolute. The men were stretched out across the lagoon, moving with a slow-motion grace through the resisting water. It was a walk that felt like it lasted for an eternity, a journey of inches where every step was a victory of the will over the body's desire to stop. But in this long, watery walk, Elias was not alone. He looked to his left and saw a boy named Arthur, a quiet soul from the docks of Brooklyn who had never seen a hill higher than a bridge. Arthur was struggling with the weight of his radio, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Without a word, Elias moved closer, placing a steadying hand on Arthur's shoulder. There was no need for grand speeches. The touch said everything. It said, "I am here." It said, "We move together." In the middle of that vast, blue lagoon, that simple contact was the only thing that mattered. It was a bridge of human kindness built over a foundation of sharp coral. They moved as one, two boys from different worlds finding a common rhythm in the pulse of the sea. The reality of Tarawa was a sensory shock. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the heavy, metallic tang of the struggle. The sun beat down with a relentless, white heat that turned the water into a shimmering haze. But within that haze, there were moments of profound, quiet heroism. Elias saw a man stop in the middle of the lagoon to help a comrade who had tripped over a coral head. He saw them share a canteen, the water precious and sweet, passed between them like a sacred gift. He saw men speaking in low, urgent whispers, encouraging one another with nicknames and memories of home. Think of the steak at Casey's. One would say. Think of the way the snow looks on the mountain, another would reply. These were the things that kept them moving when the legs grew heavy and the heart grew weary. They were fueling themselves with the poetry of their pasts. When they finally reached the narrow strip of sand, the world became even smaller. They huddled against a low wall made of coconut logs, the wood rough and fibrous against their backs. The sand was everywhere, in their hair, in their eyes, and in the seams of their clothing. It was a monochromatic world of tan and gray. Elias sat there, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached out and touched the log wall, feeling the vibration of the world through the wood. Next to him, a Marine was carefully cleaning his glasses with a piece of a torn handkerchief, his movements slow and methodical, as if he were sitting in a library back in Ohio. This small act of normalcy was an anchor in the storm. It was a way of saying that the person he was, the student, the reader, the son, was still there, tucked beneath the green fabric of the uniform. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the lagoon, the tide finally began to turn. The water crept back over the coral, a soft, rising blanket that seemed to want to wash away the memory of the day. The night on the beach was not a time of sleep, but a time of shared vigil. The men sat close together, their shoulders touching, finding warmth in the collective presence of their brothers. They spoke in whispers that were barely louder than the sound of the waves lapping against the shore. They talked about the things they would do when the world was quiet again. Elias told Arthur about the workshop and the smell of the cedar. Arthur told Elias about the way the lights of the city looked from the ferry at night. In the darkness of that tiny atoll, they were building a future out of words and dreams. There is a story of a Marine who, during that first long night, found a small, colorful bird that had been stunned by the noise. He picked it up with hands that had spent the day gripping steel, and he held it against his chest, warming it until its heart began to beat steadily again. When the bird finally took flight into the dark sky, the men around him watched it go in silence. It was a small moment of mercy in a place that seemed to have none. It was a reminder that the capacity for kindness is never truly lost, no matter how harsh the environment or how cruel the edge of the coral. The resilience of the men at Tarawa was found in their ability to see the human being next to them. When the tide turned and the situation felt most dire, they didn't look to the horizon for a miracle, they looked to each other. They found strength in the shared canteen, in the whispered joke, and in the steady, unwavering gaze of a friend. They were learning that courage is not a solo performance, but a symphony of small, interconnected acts. Elias realized that he wasn't just fighting for a cause or a country, he was moving forward for Arthur, and for the boy with the glasses, and for the man who saved the bird. By the second morning, the island looked different. The light was softer, a pale lavender that touched the tops of the shattered palm trees. The lagoon was once again a peaceful, shimmering blue, hiding the sharp edges of the coral beneath its surface. Elias stood up, his bones aching and his skin tight with salt, but his spirit felt strangely clear. He had walked across the bones of the sea and found that he was still standing. He looked at Arthur, who was adjusting his radio with a determined look on his face. They didn't need to speak. The bond they had forged in the water was stronger than any physical thing. They were no longer just recruits, they were the architects of a shared survival. The struggle at Tarawa would be remembered for its intensity, but for the men who were there, it was a story of moments. It was the moment the hand reached out in the water. It was the moment the letter was read by the light of a tiny match. It was the moment the bird flew away. These are the quiet threads that make up the fabric of history. The coral is still there, beneath the waves, its edges still sharp and its heart still ancient. But the memory of the men who walked upon it is softened by the passage of time, turning into a gentle story of endurance and the enduring power of human connection. As the ships eventually pulled away from that tiny atoll, the men looked back one last time. The island was a green smudge on the horizon, a place that had demanded everything from them and given them back a version of themselves they hadn't known existed. Elias reached into his pocket and touched the stone from his driveway. It was still there, a little smoother now, perhaps worn down by the salt and the friction of the journey. He thought of his mother's quilt and the smell of the cedar, and he knew that he was carrying those things with him, keeping them safe until the day he could bring them home. Sleep now, and imagine the quiet lap of the waves against the shore. Think of the water as a gentle hand, smoothing over the jagged edges of the day. Know that even when the path is sharp and the tide is against you, there is a strength in the touch of a friend and a peace in the memory of home. The coral is at rest, the stars are watching over the lagoon, and the world is breathing in a slow, steady rhythm. You are safe, you are remembered, and the morning will bring a light that is soft and kind, washing over the world like a long-awaited tide. In the place where the world dissolves, there is no longer a line between the ocean and the air, only a soft, gray curtain that hums with the song of 1,000 falling drops. This was Cape Gloucester, a land where the sky seemed to have grown heavy and tired, leaning its weight against the emerald shoulders of the jungle until everything, the trees, the earth, and the men, was submerged in a sea of silver mist. For the young Marines who found themselves here, life was no longer measured in miles or hours, but in the steady, rhythmic pulse of the monsoon. It was a world of liquid shadows, where the sun was a forgotten myth and the only reality was the gentle, relentless touch of the rain. Imagine a boy named Samuel. He came from the high, arid plains of Arizona, a place where the dirt was cracked and thirsty, and the air felt like a warm breath against the skin. To Samuel, water had always been a rare and sacred gift, something to be celebrated when it finally tumbled from the summer clouds. But here, on this jagged edge of the Pacific, water was the very fabric of existence. It lived in his boots, it nestled in the folds of his collar, it sat upon his eyelashes like tiny, clear jewels. As he sat beneath the broad, dripping canopy of a banyan tree, he watched the world turn into a watercolor painting, the greens and browns blurring together under the weight of the deluge. There was a strange, meditative peace in it, a realization that he was no longer a separate thing from the island, but a part of its breathing, sodden soul. In this place, the most profound treasures were not made of gold or silver, but of cotton and wool. To a man who has lived for weeks in the damp, a dry pair of socks is not merely clothing, it is a miracle. Samuel reached into the very bottom of his waterproof bag, his fingers searching for a small bundle he had wrapped in layers of oilcloth with the precision of a jeweler. When he finally felt the coarse, dry texture of the wool, a shiver of pure, uncomplicated joy ran through him. He pulled them out slowly, cradling them as if they were fragile birds. The act of pulling on those dry socks was a ritual of profound grace. For a few beautiful minutes, the chill of the jungle receded, replaced by a warmth that started at his toes and traveled all the way to his heart. It was a small victory, a quiet rebellion against the elements that reminded him he was still a man who deserved comfort, even here, where the water meets the sky. Beside him sat a friend, a boy they called Benny. Benny was a storyteller, the kind of soul who could find a silver lining in the thickest storm cloud. While the rain drummed against their makeshift poncho shelter, Benny spoke in low, melodic tones about the diners back in Chicago. He didn't talk about the war or the maps, he talked about the smell of onions grilling on a flat top and the way the neon signs reflected in the puddles on a rainy city street. In the jungle, these stories were like lanterns. They cast a warm, familiar light over the dark, strange trees. Samuel listened, his eyes closed, letting Benny's voice carry him away from the mud and the mist. This was the everyday heroism of the Corps, the man who uses his words to build a roof over his brother's head when the sky has fallen. They shared a single canteen of water, not because they were thirsty, the world was made of water, but because the act of sharing was a way of saying, I am here, and you are here, and that is enough. The psychology of the rain was a curious thing. It could be a weight, yes, but it could also be a shield. In the deep of the night, when the rain was at its heaviest, it created a wall of sound that wrapped around the Marines like a cocoon. It muffled the sounds of the world, leaving them alone with their thoughts and their memories. Samuel found that in the silence of the storm, he could hear the voices of home more clearly than ever before. He could hear the screen door slamming back on the ranch. He could hear the low lowing of the cattle in the distance. He could hear the scratch of his mother's pen as she wrote him letters he hadn't yet received. These sounds were his sanctuary. He tucked them away in the quiet corners of his mind, keeping them dry and safe from the dampness that threatened to soak through everything else. There is a story of a young corporal at Cape Gloucester who spent his afternoons carving small, wooden boats out of fallen branches. He would sit in the mud, his hands moving with a gentle, practiced rhythm, turning the rough wood into something sleek and purposeful. When he was finished, he would set the boats adrift in the small, rushing streams that formed between the roots of the trees. The other men would watch in silence as the tiny vessels were carried away by the current, disappearing into the green depths of the jungle. It was a poetic gesture, a way of sending a piece of themselves out into the world, a message in a bottle without a note. It was a reminder that even when they were stuck in the mire, their spirits could still travel, still move, still find a way to reach the sea. The letters that arrived at Cape Gloucester were often damp by the time they reached the men, the ink slightly blurred as if the words themselves had been crying. Samuel received one such letter from his younger sister. She wrote about the new kittens in the barn and how she had learned to bake a peach cobbler that actually tasted like peaches. As Samuel read the letter, the paper felt soft and fragile in his hands, like a piece of old silk. He had to be careful not to tear it as he turned the page. But the message was clear. It was a thread of sunlight reaching through the gray canopy. He realized that for his sister, the world was still bright and dry and filled with the scent of peaches. This thought gave him a peculiar kind of strength. He wasn't just enduring the rain for himself, he was enduring it so that she would never have to know what it felt like to have the sky lean so heavily against her shoulders. Resilience in the monsoon was found in the ability to find beauty in the small, glistening details. Samuel noticed the way the moss grew in thick, vibrant carpets over the rotting logs, a green so bright it looked like it was glowing from within. He watched the way the raindrops clung to the silver webs of spiders, turning them into necklaces of diamonds. He saw the kindness in a medic who spent his night drying the forehead of a feverish boy with a precious, clean rag. These were the moments where the human spirit proved it was stronger than the elements. The rain could soak their clothes, it could rust their gear, and it could turn their paths into rivers, but it could not wash away the capacity for wonder or the impulse for compassion. At night, the world at Cape Gloucester became a place of profound mystery. The bioluminescence of the jungle would wake up, fungi that glowed with a pale, ghostly blue, and insects that trailed light like tiny, falling stars. To a boy lying in the mud, it looked as though the sky had actually fallen to the earth, as if he were resting amongst the constellations. The water meeting the sky was no longer a metaphor, it was a physical reality. Samuel would lie back, letting the rain wash over his face, and feel as though he were floating in the center of the universe. The fear that usually lived in the pit of his stomach would soften into a quiet awe. He was a small, damp speck in a vast, luminous world, and in that smallness, there was a strange kind of safety. The everyday heroism of Cape Gloucester was often the heroism of the mundane. It was the man who kept the coffee pot going over a sputtering, smoky fire, providing a bitter, hot comfort to the shivering sentries. It was the sergeant who spoke in a whisper, not of orders, but of the things he wanted to build when he got back home, a porch, a cradle, a life. It was the way the men checked on each other's feet, a humble and intimate act of care that bound them together more tightly than any vow. They were a community of the soaked, a brotherhood of the mist, finding warmth in the collective heat of their own humanity. When the sun finally did break through the clouds, it didn't arrive with a shout, but with a tentative, golden finger of light that poked through the canopy. The world began to steam, the moisture rising from the earth in long, white plumes. To Samuel, it looked as though the island were breathing out a long-held sigh. The colors of the jungle sharpened, the deep reds of the tropical flowers, the brilliant yellows of the birds, the dark, rich browns of the soil. The rain was not gone, it had simply retreated into the leaves, waiting for the next turn of the tide. But for those few hours of light, the men stood tall, turning their faces to the warmth, feeling the salt and the damp crusting on their skin. They were survivors of the deluge, architects of a quiet endurance. As we think of those men tonight, let us remember that strength is not always found in the roar of the thunder, but in the steady, quiet rhythm of the rain. It is found in the patience to wait for the clouds to part and the kindness to share a dry sock in the dark. Cape Gloucester was a trial by water, a journey into a world where the horizon had vanished, but the men who walked those sodden paths found a different kind of horizon within themselves. They found that even when the sky is heavy and the earth is liquid, the human heart can still find a way to stay afloat. Sleep now, and listen to the soft drum of the rain against your own window. Let it be a reminder of the quiet resilience that lives within us all. Imagine the silver mist of the islands, the glowing blue of the jumbled floor, and the warmth of a shared story in the dark. The world is soft, the water is gentle, and the sky is watching over you with a million clear eyes. You are safe in the heart of the storm, wrapped in the memory of those who walked where the water meets the sky and found the light that never goes out. The higher we climbed, the more the world below looked like a sapphire dropped into a bowl of white dust. On the island of Saipan, the earth did not offer the soft, damp embrace of the jungle. Instead, it rose up in jagged, sun-bleached limestone, a fortress of rock that seemed to reach for the very center of the sun. For the young men moving upward, their boots crunching against the dry stone, the world had become a vertical journey. It was a climb toward the clouds, leaving the familiar safety of the beaches far behind, until the only things left were the heat, the wind, and the quiet, steady rhythm of their own breathing. Imagine a young man named Jack. He grew up in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the peaks were rounded and covered in a soft, green velvet of ancient trees. To Jack, heights had always been a place of sanctuary, a place to look out over the valley and feel a sense of peace. But here, the heights were different. They were sharp and unforgiving. The sun did not just shine, it leaned against his back with a heavy, golden hand, pulling the moisture from his skin and turning the air into a shimmering haze. As he climbed, Jack focused on the small things, the way the light caught the edge of a white butterfly, the way a tiny weed managed to find a home in a crack in the rock, and the steady, reassuring presence of the man climbing just ahead of him. That man was a quiet soul named Thomas. Thomas didn't talk much about the war, but he talked a lot about his garden back in Ohio. As they paused to catch their breath in the thin strip of shade provided by a limestone overhang, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter that had been read so many times the paper felt like soft linen. He didn't read it aloud, he just traced the lines with his thumb. He told Jack about the tomatoes his wife was planting, how she'd complained about the crows and the way the morning dew looked on the vines. In that moment, surrounded by the harsh, baking rock of the Pacific, the two of them were transported to a porch in the Midwest. The heat of the island faded, replaced by the imagined scent of damp earth and ripening fruit. This was the everyday heroism of the heights, the ability to carry a piece of a peaceful world up a mountain of stone, keeping it safe for the person beside you. The climb was a sensory tapestry of contrast. Below them, the Pacific Ocean was a dream of deep, endless blue, fringed by the white lace of the surf against the reef. It looked so cool, so inviting, that it felt like another planet entirely. But where they stood, the world was monochromatic, shades of tan, gray, and bone white. The dust rose in small, lazy clouds around their feet, coating their uniforms in a fine, powdery grit. Jack noticed how the dust settled in the lines of Thomas's face, making him look older, wiser, and more tired than a 20-year-old should ever be. Yet, when Thomas looked back over his shoulder to check on Jack, his eyes held a gentleness that the island couldn't touch. It was a look of shared burden, a silent promise that neither of them would have to make this climb alone. As they reached the higher ridges, the realization of the high ground began to settle over them. It wasn't a realization found in a textbook or a briefing, it was a feeling in the chest. To hold the high ground meant to be exposed to the wind and the wide, open sky. It meant looking down and seeing exactly how far they had come, and how much they had left behind. Jack stood on a ledge and looked back toward the sea. The great ships looked like tiny toys floating in a bathtub, their wakes like thin, white threads. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability. Up here, there was nowhere to hide from the beauty of the world, and nowhere to hide from its sorrows. He thought of the empty spaces in the ranks, the boys who had been with them on the beach but whose footprints had stopped at the base of the cliffs. The high ground was a lonely place, a pedestal of stone built on the quiet sacrifices of those who couldn't make the climb. In the caves that pockmarked the limestone, they found more than just the shadows of a struggle, they found the remnants of lives. Jack stepped into one such cave during a quiet afternoon, seeking a moment's respite from the glare. In the corner, he found a small, discarded doll made of straw and a few bits of colorful fabric. It was a reminder that this island was more than a map, it was a home. He picked it up with hands that were calloused and stained with dust, feeling the fragility of it. He didn't see an enemy in that cave, he saw a family, a child, a story that had been interrupted. He tucked the doll into a small crevice in the rock, a gesture of quiet respect for a life he would never know. It was an act of mercy in a place of stone, a way of saying that even in the midst of the climb, the heart could still find room for compassion. The kindness on the slopes of Saipan was often whispered. It was the way a Marine would pass his canteen to a thirsty comrade, even when his own throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. It was the way they would sit in silence at night, their shoulders touching, providing a human warmth that the cooling rock could not. Jack remembered a night on the ridge when the wind was particularly cold, howling through the jagged peaks like a lost spirit. A boy named Peter, who was usually the joker of the squad, began to hum a low, melodic tune. It was an old lullaby, something his grandmother had sung to him in the hills of Kentucky. One by one, the other men joined in, their voices a soft, ragged chorus against the dark. They weren't singing for victory or for pride, they were singing to remind themselves that they were still loved, that they were still human, and that the stars above them were the same stars that watched over their homes. The resilience of the men on the heights was a quiet, stubborn thing. It was found in the way they kept their gear clean, the way they mended their torn clothes with bits of wire or string, and the way they never stopped talking about the future. They spoke of the cars they would drive, the houses they would build, and the quiet lives they would lead when the climbing was finally over. These dreams were their true high ground. They were the peaks they were really striving for, the summits of a life lived in peace. Jack would listen to these stories and feel a sense of profound hope. They were architects of a world that didn't yet exist, building it one whispered dream at a time. When the sun began to set over the Philippine Sea, the island underwent a miraculous transformation. The harsh, white limestone softened into shades of rose, amber, and deep violet. The shadows grew long and soft, stretching across the valleys like a tired hand. For a few brief minutes, the world was breathtakingly beautiful. The heights above the blue became a cathedral of light. Jack would sit on a rock and watch the sky turn from gold to purple, feeling the heat of the day leave the earth. In those moments, the weight of the climb felt a little lighter. He felt a sense of connection to the ancient stone beneath him and the vast, turning sky above. He was a small part of a very large and very beautiful world, a century at the edge of the horizon. The cost of the high ground was always there, tucked away in the quiet corners of their minds. It was the weight of the memories they carried, the faces of the friends they had lost, and the heavy realization that some things can never be replaced. But as Jack looked at Thomas, and Thomas looked at the sunset, there was a shared understanding that the climb was worth it. Not for the land itself, but for the people they were becoming. They were learning that strength is not found in the power of the hand, but in the endurance of the heart. They were learning that even on a mountain of stone, a flower of kindness can still find a way to bloom. As the stars began to appear, one by one, lighting up the dark velvet of the sky, the camp fell into a deep, respectful silence. The only sound was the low whistle of the wind through the limestone. Jack reached into his pack and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, a drawing his little brother had sent him of a house with a red roof and a big, yellow sun. He held it for a long time, letting the memory of his brother's laugh fill the quiet spaces of his heart. He wasn't a soldier on a ridge, he was a brother, a son, a boy who loved a house with a red roof. He was safe in the high ground of his own memories. Sleep now, and imagine the soft, cooling rock of the island beneath you. Feel the wind as it travels across the wide, blue Pacific, carrying the scent of salt and the promise of a new day. Think of the heights not as a place of struggle, but as a place of perspective, a place where you can see the beauty of the world and the strength of the human spirit. The sun has set, the climb has paused, and the stars are watching over the peaks and the valleys alike. You are held in the gentle embrace of the night, a passenger on a journey toward the light, resting in the quiet sanctuary of the heights above the blue. Sometimes, the most profound victories are won in the moments when the world simply stands still. On the island of Tinian, after the long, jagged climb of the mountains left behind, the earth began to flatten into a landscape that felt like a half-remembered dream of home. It was a place of wide, green fields and the soft, rhythmic rustle of sugarcane, a sea of stalks that swayed in the Pacific breeze with a sound like silk brushing against silk. For the young Marines who moved through these fields, the air felt different here. It was lighter, sweeter, carrying the scent of crushed sugar and salt spray. For a brief window in time, the heavy drumbeat of the war seemed to fade into a low hum, leaving room for the small, luminous wonders of the world to step into the light. Imagine a young man named Caleb. He is 20 years old, and in his mind, he still carries the dust of the Nebraska plains. To Caleb, Tinian felt familiar in a way that made his heart ache with a gentle, bittersweet longing. The flat horizon and the swaying crops reminded him of the cornfields back home, where the summer evenings were long and the world was measured by the distance between farmhouses. As he sat on the edge of a shallow trench at the edge of a sugarcane field, he watched the sun dip below the waves. It wasn't the fiery, bruised sunset of a battlefield, it was a soft, peach-colored glow that touched the tops of the cane stalks and turned them into rows of golden spears. In that quiet hour, Caleb felt the tension in his jaw finally begin to release. He wasn't a soldier in that moment, he was just a boy watching the day end. As the twilight deepened into a velvet purple, something miraculous began to happen. It started as a single, tiny pulse of light near the ground, a flicker so brief Caleb thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Then another appeared, and another, until the edges of the field were alive with hundreds of tiny, floating lanterns. Fireflies. They drifted through the sugarcane in a slow, silent dance, their greenish-gold light pulsing in a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of the island itself. Caleb sat perfectly still, his breath held in his chest, watching the tiny sparks rise and fall. He hadn't seen a firefly since the last summer before he enlisted, and the sight of them here, thousands of miles from his porch, felt like a message whispered directly to his soul. Beside him sat Gus, a boy from the crowded, neon-lit streets of Chicago. Gus had never seen a firefly in his life. He watched them with a wide-eyed, silent wonder that stripped away the hardness of the weeks behind them. "What are they, Caleb?" he whispered, his voice barely louder than the rustle of the leaves. Caleb smiled, a slow, genuine expression that reached his eyes for the first time in months. "Just bits of the stars that decided to come down for a walk," he replied. They sat there together, the farm boy and the city boy, joined by a spectacle of nature that didn't know anything of maps or movements. In the soft glow of the fireflies, the world felt whole again. It was a meditative pause, a sanctuary of light in a time of deep shadows. Caleb reached into his pack and pulled out a small, wooden crate he had found near a deserted farmhouse earlier that day. It was empty, but it served as a perfect desk. He pulled out a sheet of paper and a pencil, and by the faint, pulsing light of the fireflies and a sliver of a moon, he began to write. He didn't write about the heat or the long marches. He wrote about the sugar cane. He wrote to his little sister, telling her that the island looked like a giant garden and that the air smelled like the candy shop in town. He told her about the fireflies, describing how they looked like tiny golden stitches sewing the earth and the sky back together. He wanted her to know that there was still beauty in the world, even in the places where the shadows were longest. As he wrote, the pencil felt light in his hand, and the words flowed with a simple, poetic ease. The resilience of the human spirit is often found in these brief flashes of beauty. It is the ability to see a flower blooming in the dust and recognize it as a miracle. On Tinian, the men found these miracles everywhere when they took the time to look. They found them in the way the rain would clear suddenly to reveal a rainbow that stretched from one end of the horizon to the other. They found them in the shared taste of a ripe pineapple, its juice sweet and sharp, passed from hand to hand like a communal blessing. They found them in the quiet, everyday heroism of a friend who offered to take the first watch so another could get an extra hour of dreamless sleep. These were the fireflies of their lives, tiny, flickering moments of kindness and grace that kept the darkness at bay. There is a story of a Marine on Tinian who found a small, wounded bird with feathers the color of the ocean. He didn't have much, but he used a corner of his own ration of water to keep the bird hydrated, and he fashioned a small nest for it inside his helmet. For 3 days, he carried that helmet in his hands rather than on his head, walking with a careful, steady gait to keep from jarring his tiny passenger. When the bird finally grew strong enough to fly away, the entire squad stood in silence, watching it disappear into the bright blue sky. It was a small act of mercy, a tiny flicker of humanity that reminded every one of them why they were there. They were protecting the world's capacity for such small, fragile things. The night on Tinian was a time of deep, soulful reflection. The island was quiet, the only sound the distant, rhythmic sigh of the Pacific. Caleb lay on his back, looking up at the stars. They seemed closer here, larger and more brilliant than they ever did in Nebraska. He thought about the fireflies in the field and the fireflies in his mind, the memories of his father's laugh, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of the wind in the wheat. He realized that these memories were his true strength. They were the lights he carried with him into the dark places. He wasn't afraid of the shadows because he knew that the light was always there, waiting to be rediscovered. Gus eventually fell asleep, his head resting on his pack, his face softened by the moonlight. Caleb watched over him, feeling a profound sense of brotherhood. This was the quiet legacy of the Corps, not just the shared struggle, but the shared peace. They were the sentries of each other's dreams. They were the ones who held the space for beauty to exist. Caleb reached out and gently brushed a firefly away from Gus's hand, watching it spiral upward until it joined the sea of light in the sugarcane. It was a gesture of pure, unadorned kindness, a silent vow to protect the innocence that still remained in his friend. As the hours passed, the fireflies began to fade, their lights growing dim as they settled into the stalks for the night. The field became a dark, rustling ocean once more. But the peace they had brought remained. It sat in Caleb's chest like a warm coal. He finished his letter and tucked it away, feeling a sense of completion. He had captured a piece of the light and sent it home. He knew that when his sister read his words, she would see the fireflies too. She would feel the sweetness of the sugarcane and the softness of the Pacific night. He was building a bridge of beauty across the sea, one word at a time. The Tinian campaign was a moment of transition, a bridge between the harshness of the past and the uncertainty of the future. But for the men who sat in those fields, it was a destination in itself. It was a place where they learned that the human heart is like a firefly, it has the power to generate its own light, even in the deepest dark. They learned that resilience is not just about standing firm, it's about remaining soft enough to be moved by a flickering light in the grass. They were the architects of a quiet grace, finding the poetry in the mud and the stars in the sugarcane. As we think of them tonight, let us look for our own fireflies. Let us remember the small moments of kindness, the brief flashes of beauty, and the quiet resilience that lives within us all. Think of the sugarcane fields of Tinian, swaying in the breeze, and the thousands of tiny lights dancing in the dark. Know that even when the world feels heavy and the shadows seem long, there is a light that never goes out. It lives in the memory of a friend, in the words of a letter, and in the steady, rhythmic pulse of a heart that refuses to forget the beauty of the world. Sleep now, and let your dreams be filled with the soft, greenish-gold glow of the islands. Imagine the scent of sugar and salt, the sound of the wind in the leaves, and the feeling of a world at peace. The fireflies are resting, the stars are watching, and the dawn is waiting just beyond the horizon, carrying a light that is soft, kind, and eternal. You are safe, you are remembered, and the beauty of the world is tucked away inside you, a tiny, pulsing light that will always find its way back to the day. Some places have a memory that lives in the very grain of the soil, waiting for a footstep it recognizes to return. As the ships drew near to the island of Guam, the air seemed to carry a different weight, a scent of red earth and ancient limestone that felt, to many, like a long-lost conversation finally being resumed. For the young men standing on the decks, looking out at the emerald peaks rising from the turquoise sea, this was not just another objective on a map. It was a home that had been borrowed by shadows, and they were the ones who had promised to bring the light back. There was a quiet, solemn energy in the air, a sense that they were not just arriving, but returning to a place that had never stopped calling their names across the thousands of miles of salt and foam. Imagine a Marine named Benjamin. He was a man of quiet observations, someone who noticed the way the light changed when a storm was brewing or the way the dust settled on a windowsill. Benjamin had been a young recruit when the news of Guam's loss first reached his ears years before, and he had carried that story in a small, quiet corner of his heart ever since. To him, the island was a symbol of a broken promise, a place where people who looked to the same stars as he did had been left in the dark. Now, as the ramp of his landing craft dropped and his boots sank into the warm, familiar surf, he felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The water was clear as glass, showing the colorful pebbles and the white sand beneath, and as he stepped forward, he felt as though he were walking back into a memory he had been dreaming of for a lifetime. The return to Guam was a journey of the senses. The island did not greet them with the alien, impenetrable wall of the deeper jungles they had known before. Instead, it felt like a garden that had been allowed to grow wild. There were coconut groves that whispered in the trade winds and hills of red clay that turned the rain into a vivid, earthy wine. Benjamin noticed the way the soil clung to his boots, a deep, rich crimson that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was a soil that had seen much, a soil that had hidden the secrets of a people who had waited in the caves and the high grasses for this very moment. As the Marines moved inland, they didn't just move through terrain, they moved through a landscape of longing. In the quiet moments of the first afternoon, as the sun cast long, golden shadows through the palm fronds, the first of the local people began to emerge from the shadows. They came slowly, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a joy so profound it had no voice. Benjamin remembered an elderly woman who stepped out from behind a large banyan tree. Her hair was like spun silver, and her hands were etched with the stories of her years. She didn't say a word at first, she simply walked up to Benjamin and reached out, touching the fabric of his green sleeve with a trembling finger. In her eyes, Benjamin saw a reflection of all the prayers that had been whispered in the dark for 1,000 nights. He reached into his pack and found a small, sealed tin of crackers and a piece of chocolate that had softened in the heat. He handed them to her with a clumsy, gentle smile, and the way she took his hand in hers, warm, calloused, and strong, told him everything he needed to know about the price of a promise kept. The connection between the liberators and the liberated was a tapestry of small, silent heroisms. It was found in the Marine who spent his rest hour fixing a broken wheel on a wooden cart for a family returning to their farm. It was found in the shared shade of a porch, where a young man from Ohio sat with a grandfather from the hills of Guam, neither speaking the other's language but both understanding the peace of a quiet horizon. Benjamin watched as his friends, men who had grown hard and weary in the mud of other islands, seemed to soften here. They shared their water, their rations, and their stories. They became sons and brothers again, reminded by the kindness of the local people that there was a world worth returning to, a world where a smile was a currency and a shared meal was a sanctified thing. One evening, as the stars began to poke through the velvet sky, Benjamin sat by a small cookfire and wrote a letter home. He didn't write about the struggle or the noise. He wrote about the music. He told his mother about how, in the distance, he could hear the sound of hymn being sung in a small village that had just seen its first peaceful sunset in years. The voices were thin but steady, rising up into the tropical night like the smoke from the fires. He told her about the children who had followed them through the trails, their laughter a sound so bright it made the very air feel lighter. He wrote that for the first time since he had left home, he felt as though he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The weight he had carried, the fear, the uncertainty, the long nights of waiting, felt balanced by the simple fact that a promise had been fulfilled. The resilience of the people of Guam was a quiet, enduring flame that humbled the men who came to find them. They had lived in the hills, sustained by the land and by a faith that the horizon would one day bring their friends back. Benjamin met a young boy, perhaps no more than 8 years old, who showed him a small, hidden American flag he had kept buried in a tin box beneath a mango tree for 3 years. The fabric was stained by the red earth and frayed at the edges, but when the boy unfurled it in the sunlight, it was the most beautiful thing Benjamin had ever seen. The boy's pride was a physical thing, a radiant heat that made the Marine feel small and grateful. They sat together under the tree, the soldier and the child, and Benjamin realized that the true victory wasn't found in the taking of a hill, but in the preserving of that boy's hope. There was a poetic symmetry to the days on the island. The red mud that had once seemed like a burden became a badge of belonging. The Marines were covered in the very earth they had come to save, their uniforms stained the color of the island's heart. They learned the names of the trees, the breadfruit, the flame tree, the ironwood, and they learned the stories of the families who had tended them for generations. The island was no longer a theater of war, it was a place of healing. Benjamin noticed how the men would walk more slowly, speak more softly, as if they were afraid of breaking the fragile peace that was just beginning to bloom again in the valleys. Kindness moved through the camps like a gentle, cooling rain. A group of women brought woven baskets of fresh fruit to the thirsty men, their faces beaming with a pride that transcended the hardships they had endured. In return, the Marines shared their tobacco, their soap, and the precious letters they had received from home, showing photographs of their own families to people who treated those pictures like sacred relics. In those exchanges, the vast distance of the Pacific Ocean seemed to shrink until it was no wider than the space between two people sitting on a log. They were all part of the same human family, bound together by the shared experience of surviving the dark and stepping out into the morning. As the campaign drew to a close and the island began to settle into its new reality, a profound sense of relief washed over the men. The promise kept was a quiet internal light that guided them through their final duties. They helped clear the debris from the schools and the churches, their hands moving with a rhythmic, purposeful grace. Benjamin spent his last afternoon on the island sitting on a limestone cliff overlooking the sea. The water below was a kaleidoscope of blues, shifting from the pale turquoise of the shallows to the deep, midnight indigo of the abyss. He felt a deep, resonant peace, the kind that only comes when a debt has been paid in full. He looked at his hands, still stained faintly red by the soil of Guam, and he knew that he would carry this island with him forever. The night before they were to move on to the next horizon, the island gave them a gift of absolute stillness. There was no wind, and the ocean was so calm it reflected the moon like a silver mirror. Benjamin lay on his back, looking up at the canopy of stars, and he thought about the woman with the silver hair and the boy with the hidden flag. He realized that they had given him more than he could ever give them. They had given him back his belief in the goodness of people. They had shown him that even in the most absolute darkness, the human spirit is a lighthouse that never stops searching for the shore. As we think of those men tonight, let us remember that the greatest promises are not those made with words, but those kept with footsteps. Let us think of the red soil of Guam and the way it held the dreams of a people until the world was ready to hear them again. The island is at rest now, the waves are lapping gently against the white sand, and the promise remains, carved into the very stone of the cliffs and the memory of the trees. Sleep now, and let the peace of that liberated shore wash over you. Imagine the scent of the flame trees in the evening air, the sound of a distant hymn carried on the breeze, and the feeling of a world that has finally found its way home. The stars are watching over the Pacific, the red earth is warm beneath the moon, and the promise is kept, held safe in the quiet, enduring heart of the world. You are safe, you are part of a long and beautiful story, and the morning will bring a light that is clear, certain, and kind. There is a place where the world turns to bone, white and jagged under a sun that never blinks. On the island of Peleliu, the lush, emerald tapestries of the Pacific were replaced by a landscape of ancient, scorched limestone, a kingdom of coral that had long ago forgotten the cool embrace of the sea. For the young Marines who stepped into this world of white dust and shimmering heat, it felt as though they had landed on the surface of a dead star. The air did not move, it sat heavy and dry, tasting of powdered stone and salt. Here, in the ridges that rose like the teeth of a giant, the human heart was asked to do something impossible, to become as hard and as resilient as the rock itself, while somehow holding onto the fragile light of home. Imagine a young man named Julian. He was 19 years old, and in his mind, he still carried the cool, damp scent of the pine forests in Oregon, where the moss grew thick over the fallen logs and the rivers were always icy to the touch. But on the ridges of Peleliu, the only moisture was the sweat that stung his eyes and the precious, warm water at the bottom of a metal canteen. Julian sat in a shallow depression in the rock, his back against a wall of limestone that felt like it had been baking in an oven for 1,000 years. Everything was white, the ground, the dust on his uniform, the very light that reflected off the jagged peaks. It was a monochromatic world where the only color was the deep, endless blue of the sky and the dark, yawning mouths of the caves that watched them from the heights. The caves of this island were not just hollow spaces in the earth, they were cathedrals of shadow and lost echoes. To look into one was to peer into a silence that felt ancient and heavy. Julian often found himself staring into those dark openings during the long, quiet hours of the afternoon. He wondered about the echoes that lived inside, the whispers of the wind, the dripping of water that no one could reach, and the private thoughts of the men who waited in the cool gloom. It was in these moments that he felt the world narrowing down. The vast strategies of generals and the movement of fleets meant nothing to a boy whose world had become a single ledge of white stone and a handful of dry rations. He felt his spirit beginning to calcify, taking on the texture of the island, hardening its edges so that the sharpness of the place wouldn't cut so deep. But even in a place made of bone and fire, the human spirit finds a way to remain soft in the secret places. Julian carried a photograph in his breast pocket, wrapped in a piece of clear celluloid to keep the dust away. It was a picture of his younger sister sitting on a garden swing, her hair caught in a midsummer breeze. Every evening, when the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the white rock began to radiate a soft, ghostly violet light, Julian would pull out the photo. He wouldn't look at it for long, just enough to remember that there was a world where things grew, where the earth was soft, and where a person could breathe without tasting the desert. That small, rectangular piece of paper was his anchor. It was the one part of him that refused to turn to stone. It was a quiet, private rebellion against the harshness of the island. The everyday heroism of the ridges was found in the shared silence and the small, sacrificial acts of kindness. Thirst was a constant companion, a dry ache that lived in the back of the throat and the roof of the mouth. Water was more valuable than gold, more precious than any metal. Julian remembered a boy named Silas, a quiet soul from the dusty plains of Texas who seemed to understand the sun better than most. Silas's own canteen had been damaged, the water leaking away into the thirsty limestone. Without a word, Julian had reached out and pressed his own canteen into Silas's hand. They didn't speak, their voices were too raspy for words, and the gesture didn't need them. Silas took a single, measured sip and handed it back, his eyes speaking a gratitude. That was deeper than any speech. In that moment, the hardness of the ridges seemed to crack. The stone was still there, but the men between the rocks were still human, still bound by a thread of shared mercy. Resilience on Peleliu was a slow, grinding process. It was the ability to wake up when the sun rose and face the white-hot glare for another 12 hours. It was the patience to wait in the shadows of a limestone overhang, listening to the rhythmic clicking of the insects and the distant, hollow echo of a falling stone. The men learned the language of the rocks, the way the heat made the air shimmer until the ridges seemed to dance, the way the wind would whistle through the narrow canyons like a flute made of bone. They became part of the geology of the place. Julian noticed how his hands had become the color of the dust, and how his thoughts had become slower, more deliberate, as if he were conserving the energy of his soul. In the deep of the night, the island transformed. The heat would slowly bleed out of the stone, replaced by a chill that felt as sharp as a knife. The white ridges would glow under the light of a desert moon, looking like a landscape of ice. It was then that the echoes would truly wake up. Julian would lie on his back, looking up at stars that seemed so bright and so close he felt he could reach out and touch them. He would hear the low murmur of the men in the nearby holes, not talk of the war, but the soft, rhythmic sounds of memory. They spoke of the smell of rain on a hot sidewalk, the sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning, and the taste of a cold glass of milk. These were the echoes they brought with them into the caves, the sounds of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. There was a story told in whispers of a marine who found a small, stunted tree growing in a deep crevice of a ridge where a tiny bit of soil had managed to gather. It had no leaves, only a few gray, twisted branches that looked like a hand reaching out of the rock. Every day, the man would take the last few drops of water from his canteen, the drops most men would have fought for, and pour them onto the roots of that little tree. His friends watched him in silence, never questioning the act. They understood that he wasn't just watering a plant, he was watering his own hope. He was making a stand for life in a place that seemed to celebrate only the ancient and the dead. When a single, tiny green bud finally appeared on one of those gray branches, it was as if the entire squad had been given a new lease on life. They would take turns checking on the bud, guarding it as if it were the most important position on the island. The Cave of Lost Echoes was a place where the past and the present blurred together. Julian found that he could no longer remember the faces of the people he had known before the war with perfect clarity, but he could remember the feelings. He remembered the feeling of a hand on his shoulder, the feeling of a warm kitchen, the feeling of being safe. He realized that the island could take his water, it could take his strength, and it could turn his skin to the color of the dust, but it could not take his capacity to feel. The heart might grow hard like the stone to survive the day, but in the quiet of the night, it would soften again, opening up to the echoes of the world he had left behind. As the weeks passed, the men of the ridges became masters of endurance. They learned to find comfort in the smallest of things, the shade of a poncho, the smell of a fresh cigarette, the weight of a letter from home that had been read until the ink had faded. They were the architects of a quiet, stubborn survival. Julian looked at the men around him and saw not soldiers, but brothers of the stone. They were bound by a shared experience of the sun and the dust that no one else would ever truly understand. They had seen the world at its most unforgiving and had found that they were stronger than the rock. When the time finally came to leave the white ridges of Peleliu, the departure was a solemn, quiet affair. As Julian walked back toward the beach, his boots once again sinking into the soft sand, he looked back at the ridges one last time. They looked peaceful in the afternoon light, their jagged edges softened by the haze. He knew that he was leaving a part of himself behind in those caves, the echoes of his fears and the shadows of his long, thirsty hours. But he was also carrying something away. He was carrying the knowledge that the heart, no matter how hard it has to become, can always find its way back to being soft. He was carrying the memory of the shared canteen and the tiny green bud on the twisted tree. The ship pulled away from the island, and the white peaks began to shrink into the blue horizon. Julian sat on the deck, feeling the cool salt spray on his face for the first time in a month. He reached into his pocket and touched the photograph of his sister. The edges were frayed and the paper was dusted with the white silt of the ridges, but the girl on the swing was still smiling. He closed his eyes and listened to the rhythmic thrum of the ship's engine, a new echo to add to the many he carried. He was moving toward the green world again, toward the rain and the moss and the cool rivers of home. Sleep now, and imagine the soft, silver light of the moon over the white ridges of the Pacific. Feel the coolness of the night air as it brushes against the stone, smoothing over the jagged edges of the day. Know that even in the harshest landscape, there is a place for kindness, a place for memory, and a place for the heart to rest. The echoes are quiet, the stars are watching over the sea and the stone alike, and the morning will find you refreshed, carrying the quiet strength of those who walked through the bone-white world and never lost their way home. You are safe, you are remembered, and the world is waiting for you with a gentle, cooling rain. The sun did not just shine upon the ridges of the Immerbergal, it seemed to live there, a heavy, golden guest that refused to leave. On this island of white stone, the heat was a physical weight, a shimmering veil that blurred the edges of the world until the jagged peaks looked like waves of frozen fire. For the young men clinging to the limestone, life had simplified into a single, rhythmic prayer, a prayer for the cool, for the shade, and most of all, for a single, silver drop of water. It was a time when the human spirit was tested not by the strength of its stride, but by the quiet endurance of its thirst, and where the most profound act of heroism was found in the simple tilting of a metal canteen toward a friend's parched lips. Imagine a young man named Finn. He grew up in the lake country of Minnesota, a place where the world was mostly water, deep, cold, and blue. In Finn's memory, the sound of the world was the lap of waves against a cedar dock and the clinking of ice in a pitcher of lemonade on a shaded porch. But here, in the heart of the ridges they called the Bloody Nose, water was no longer a thing taken for granted. It was a holy substance, measured in caps and sips, kept in steel containers that grew so hot in the sun they could burn the skin. Finn sat in a crevice of rock, his back against the limestone, watching the heat waves dance over the valley. His tongue felt thick and heavy in his mouth, like a piece of dry wool, and his throat was a dusty road that hadn't seen rain in a lifetime. Beside him lay Miller, a man nearly 10 years his senior who had once been a high school teacher in a quiet town in Indiana. Miller was a man of books and steady nerves, but the heat of the Immerbergal had stripped away everything but the core of his character. He lay with his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, conserving every ounce of moisture his body possessed. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, when the sun reached its zenith and the world seemed to hold its breath, Miller reached out and touched Finn's arm. It was a slow, deliberate movement. He unscrewed the cap of his canteen, a sound that, in the absolute silence of the ridge, was as clear as a bell, and held it out to Finn. Finn knew that Miller's own supply was dangerously low. He knew that the water detail hadn't been able to make it up the steep, exposed slopes since the night before. He shook his head, a small, stubborn movement of refusal. But Miller didn't pull the canteen back. He simply waited, his hand steady despite the tremors of exhaustion. "Share the cup, Finn," Miller whispered, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like wind moving through dead grass. In that moment, the act of drinking was not just about survival, it was a communal rite. Finn took the canteen, feeling the warmth of the metal, and allowed himself a single, measured swallow. The water was warm and tasted faintly of the sun, but as it moved down his throat, it felt like a miracle. It was a moment of grace in a place made of bone and fire. This was the prayer for the thirsty that echoed across the ridges, not a spoken plea, but a lived reality of mercy. Everywhere you looked, if you looked closely enough through the haze, you could see these small, quiet wonders. You would see a Marine using a damp rag to cool the forehead of a wounded comrade, or a man shielding another from the direct glare of the sun with a piece of tattered poncho. There was an unspoken understanding that they were all part of a single, thirsty body, and that to save one was to save the whole. They were learning that the heart does not dry up even when the well does. Finn found himself retreating into the cool galleries of his mind to escape the white-hot reality of the stone. He would think of the winter of 36, when the snow drifted so high it covered the windows of the farmhouse. He could almost feel the biting, wonderful chill of the wind against his face. He remembered his father carving blocks of ice from the lake, the giant saw sending up clouds of silver spray that froze instantly in the air. He would hold these memories like a piece of ice under his tongue, letting the imagined cold soothe the very real fever of the island. These memories were his sanctuary, a private garden where the rain never stopped and the rivers always ran deep. There was a story whispered among the squads of a boy who had found a small, rusted tin cup in the ruins of a village at the base of the ridges. He carried it with him everywhere, and whenever the rare, sudden tropical squalls would break over the peaks, he would stand out in the open, holding his cup to the sky. He wouldn't drink the water himself. He would carry the full cup back to the aid station, moving with the careful, focused gait of a man carrying a king's crown. He would offer it to the men who couldn't stand, giving them a taste of the clouds. This was the everyday heroism of the Immerbergal, the refusal to let the harshness of the terrain dictate the limits of the soul. As the afternoon sun began its slow, agonizing descent toward the sea, the world on the ridges underwent a subtle change. The white glare of the limestone softened into shades of amber and rose, and the shadows grew long and cool, stretching like fingers across the jagged canyons. The air, though still warm, lost its jagged edge. Finn felt the first stirrings of the evening breeze, a soft, salt-tossed breath from the Pacific that carried the promise of the night. He looked at Miller, who was now awake, staring out at the horizon with a look of profound peace. They didn't need to speak about the shared water. The bond was already forged, a silent pact written in the dust. The resilience of the thirsty was a quiet, stubborn flame. It was the ability to find a reason to smile when the lips were cracked and the spirit was weary. Finn remembered a moment when a sergeant, a man known for his sternness, had found a small, colorful lizard trapped in a dry crevice. He had used a few drops from his own precious supply to wet the rock so the lizard could drink. The men around him had watched in silence, a collective softening in their eyes. It was a reminder that they were there to protect life, in all its forms, and that the capacity for pity was the one thing the island could never take from them. The night on the Immerbergal brought a different kind of challenge. The temperature would drop, and the heat that had been stored in the stone would radiate upward in a soft, ghostly warmth. But the thirst remained. In the darkness, the sound of a sloshing canteen in the next foxhole was a form of music, a reassurance that life was still present. Finn would lie on his back, looking up at the stars, and think of the letters he wanted to write. He wouldn't write about the heat or the stone. He would write about the people. He would tell his mother about Miller, and the boy with the tin cup, and the sergeant with the lizard. He would tell her that he had learned that a man can survive a great deal of hunger and a great deal of heat, as long as he has a friend to share the silence with. There was a profound spirituality to the waiting. The men became like the ancient monks of the desert, stripped of all distractions, left only with the essentials of existence. They learned to appreciate the smallest of mercies, the arrival of a supply mule in the dead of night, the sudden coolness of a passing cloud, the sound of a companion's steady breathing. They were discovering that strength is not found in the absence of suffering, but in the way one carries it. Finn felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with dignity. He was standing tall on a ridge that wanted him to crumble, and he was doing it with a heart that was still full of the cool waters of home. As the moon rose over the Pacific, turning the white ridges into a landscape of silver and shadow, a sense of deep, respectful quiet settled over the camp. The prayer for the thirsty had been answered, not by a change in the weather, but by the change in the men. They had found the wellspring within themselves. They had found that kindness is a water that never runs dry, and that a shared burden is a burden halved. Finn reached out and touched the cool metal of his own canteen, now nearly empty, and felt a sense of profound gratitude. He was still here. He was still himself. And tomorrow, when the sun rose again to light the limestone fires, he would be ready to share whatever he had left. Sleep now, and imagine the cool, deep lakes of the north. Feel the water as it ripples over your skin, washing away the dust and the heat of the day. Think of the ridges not as a place of hardship, but as a place where the human spirit proved it was stronger than the sun. The Pacific is whispering against the shore, the stars are watching over the thirsty and the rested alike, and the world is turning toward a morning that is soft, clear, and filled with the scent of rain. You are safe, you are part of a brotherhood of grace, and the water of memory will always be there to quench your soul. Rest in the quiet peace of a promise kept, and let the echoes of the ridges fade into a gentle, dreamless sleep. Imagine a world where the color has simply been washed away, leaving only the soft, silver ghosts of things that once were. On the island of Iwo Jima, the earth did not speak in the vibrant greens of the jungle or the sparkling blues of the lagoon. Instead, it whispered in 1,000 shades of charcoal, slate, and ash. For the young Marines who stepped onto those shores, it felt as though they had left the earth behind entirely and landed upon the silent, brooding surface of a forgotten moon. The air was thick with the scent of ancient fires, a sharp, warm tang of sulfur that rose from the ground like the breath of a sleeping giant, and everywhere one looked, there was the gray dust, a fine volcanic powder that seemed to drink the light and soften the edges of the world. Among these men was a young man named Arthur. He was 21, and in his heart, he still carried the brilliant, emerald memories of his family's flower farm in the Valley of Oregon. There, the world was a riot of color, the deep reds of tulips, the sunny yellows of daffodils, and the soft, bruised purples of the iris. But here, on this strange, monochromatic island, Arthur felt as though he were living inside a faded photograph. As he struggled to move inland, his boots sank deep into the black volcanic ash, making every step a slow, rhythmic labor. It was a place where the ground didn't want to hold you, where the very soil seemed to shift and sigh beneath your weight, a soft and yielding blanket that swallowed the sound of footsteps and left only a muffled, rhythmic crunch in the air. Arthur sat in a shallow hollow he had scooped out of the ash, feeling the warmth of the earth through his uniform. It was a strange sensation. The ground was warm to the touch, heated by the restless fires deep beneath the island's skin. In the quiet hours of the twilight, when the sun was a pale, silver coin dipping toward a charcoal sea, Arthur felt a profound sense of isolation. He looked at his hands, once stained with the rich, dark loam of his garden, now coated in the fine, gray silt of Iwo Jima. He felt like a ghost in a kingdom of shadows. But then, he reached into his pocket and felt the corner of a letter he had received just before the landing. It was from his younger sister, Grace. He pulled the letter out slowly, careful not to let the fine grit tear the fragile paper. Grace wrote about the first blooms of spring, describing the way the morning dew sat upon the petals like tiny diamonds. She wrote about the smell of the rain on the dry earth and the way the birds were returning to the old oak tree by the barn. As Arthur read her words, the gray world around him began to transform. In his mind, the black ash became the rich soil of home. The sulphurous air was replaced by the imagined scent of pine and wet grass. This was his quiet resilience, the ability to carry a garden inside his soul while walking through a desert of dust. He shared the letter with a man named Silas, who sat beside him in the gray gloom. Silas was a quiet man from the docks of New York, a man who had never seen a flower farm but understood the longing for a world with color. As Arthur read the words aloud in a low, rhythmic whisper, the two of them sat in the warmth of the earth, two boys finding a shared sanctuary in the memory of a green world. The everyday heroism of the gray dust was found in the small, tactile acts of kindness. The ash was everywhere. It was in their eyes, in their teeth, and in the seams of their hearts. Arthur remembered watching a corpsman, a boy no older than himself, spend an hour sitting with a frightened Marine. The corpsman didn't have much to offer in the way of medicine at that moment, so he simply took a clean, damp cloth and gently wiped the gray dust from the other boy's eyes. He did it with the tenderness of a mother, speaking in a low, soothing tone about the football games they would see when they got back home. That simple act of cleaning a friend's vision, of helping him see clearly in a world of shadows, was a light more brilliant than any flare. It was a reminder that even when the color is gone from the landscape, it remains in the way we care for one another. Resilience on Iwo Jima was a slow, patient endurance. The island was a fortress of stone and steam, and the men who walked it became masters of the long wait. They learned to find comfort in the monochromatic beauty of the place, the way the moonlight turned the volcanic sand into a field of shimmering silver, the way the steam rose from the vents in long, ghostly plumes that danced in the wind. They became part of the geology of the island, their faces etched with the same lines as the jagged rocks of Mount Suribachi, which loomed over them like a silent sentinel. Arthur noticed how Silas's eyes had taken on the color of the sea, a deep, slate gray that seemed to hold all the stories of the long days behind them. They were no longer the boys who had left the docks and the farms. They were something older, something harder, yet something more deeply connected to the rhythm of the earth. In the middle of the night, the silence of the island was absolute, broken only by the low, mournful whistle of the wind through the caves. Arthur would lie on his back, looking up at the stars, which seemed more vivid and crystalline than they ever did back home. Against the black velvet of the sky, the constellations were brilliant, unblinking eyes watching over the gray world. He felt a sense of peace in the vastness of the universe, a realization that he was a small, living spark in a great and ancient story. He thought of the billions of years it had taken to create the rock beneath him and the millions of miles the light had traveled to reach his eyes. In that perspective, the fears of the day seemed to soften and fade, leaving only a quiet awe for the beauty of existence. There was a story of a marine who found a small piece of sea glass on the beach, a fragment of deep, translucent green that had been smoothed by the tides of 1,000 years. He carried it in his palm like a sacred relic, passing it around so that every man in the squad could touch it. To them, that tiny piece of green was the most beautiful thing on the island. It was a fragment of the other world, a reminder that color still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. They would hold it up to the pale light of the moon and watch the way the light moved through the glass, their faces reflecting a soft, emerald glow. It was a collective meditation, a way of anchoring themselves to the reality of beauty in a place that seemed to have forgotten it. The gray dust of memory was not just about the terrain, it was about the way the mind handles the weight of the unknown. Arthur found that his private fears were like the ash, fine, persistent, and easily stirred by the wind. But he also found that the kindness of his companions was like the warmth of the earth, steady, reliable, and deeply comforting. When Silas offered him the last sip of his water, or when a neighbor shared a dry, salty biscuit without being asked, the fears would settle. They were building a world of color out of the gray, one shared moment at a time. They were the architects of a secret garden, hidden beneath the slate-colored sky. As the days turned into weeks, the men became accustomed to the surreal nature of their lives. They learned to sleep in the warmth of the volcanic sand, letting the island's heat soothe their aching bones. They learned to find the music in the crunch of the ash and the hiss of the steam. They were survivors of a different kind of world, travelers who had walked the paths of another planet and found that the human spirit is the same wherever it wanders. Arthur felt a strange, quiet pride in the gray dust on his uniform. It was a badge of his journey, a mark of the resilience he had found within himself. He was no longer afraid of the shadows, he had learned to see the silver in them. When the time finally came to leave the island, Arthur looked back at the shore from the deck of the ship. The island of Iwo Jima sat on the horizon like a great, gray whale in a charcoal sea. Mount Suribachi was draped in a soft veil of mist, its jagged peak looking peaceful in the morning light. He knew that he would carry the gray dust of the island with him for the rest of his life, not as a burden, but as a memory of the strength he had found in the silence. He thought of the letter from Grace and the piece of green sea glass, and he knew that he was returning to a world of color with a heart that had been tempered by the ash. The ship moved away, and the blue of the deep ocean began to return, a startling, vivid indigo that made Arthur's eyes ache with joy. He reached into his pocket and touched the frayed paper of the letter, feeling the connection to the garden and the oak tree and the rain. He was moving forward, leaving the monochromatic dream behind, but he was carrying the lessons of the gray with him. He had learned that light is most beautiful when it is found in the dark, and that color is most precious when it has been missed. Sleep now, and imagine the soft, silver glow of the moon over a world of silent ash. Feel the warmth of the earth rising up to meet you, a gentle embrace from an ancient world. Think of the stars as tiny, brilliant flowers blooming in the garden of the sky, watching over you with a kind and steady light. The gray dust is at rest, the steam has faded into the mist, and the ocean is a vast, indigo cradle rocking you toward the dawn. You are safe, you are part of a long and shimmering story, and the colors of the morning are waiting just beyond the horizon, ready to wash the world in a soft, golden light. Rest in the quiet sanctuary of the memory, and let the peace of the silent island carry you into a deep and dreamless sleep. High above the world of gray, a small spark of color waited to be born against the pale, morning sky. On the island of Iwo Jima, where the days felt like a long, monochromatic dream of ash and steam, the eyes of thousands were drawn, as if by an invisible thread, to the jagged crest of Mount Suribachi. For the young men huddled in the black volcanic sand of the beaches, their bodies weary and their spirits dusted with the grit of 1,000 uncertainties, that mountain had been a dark and silent shadow looming over their every breath. But on this particular morning, the wind began to carry something different, a whisper of change, a ripple of movement on the very rim of the world that would soon turn a jagged peak into a beacon of light. Imagine a young man named Silas. He is sitting in a shallow foxhole near the water's edge, the rhythmic lap of the Pacific waves sounding like a soft, steady heartbeat behind him. His hands are stained with the dark silt of the island, and his eyes are heavy with the weight of sleepless nights. Silas is thinking of his father's workshop in Maine, a place that smelled of cedar shavings and wood smoke, where the only thing that ever loomed over him was the gentle canopy of the pine trees. Here, under the sulphurous breath of the volcano, Silas felt small, like a single grain of sand lost in a great, turning hourglass. He reached into his pocket to touch a small, smooth pebble he had carried since the landing, a piece of home that felt like a secret anchor in a sea of gray. As Silas looked up, squinting against the bright, hazy glare of the sun, he noticed a stillness falling over the men around him. It wasn't the heavy, fearful silence of a watch, but a soft, expectant quiet, like the hush that settles over a theater before the curtain rises. One by one, heads began to turn toward the heights. Shoulders that had been hunched against the wind began to straighten. Away in the distance, atop the highest point of the island, a small group of figures could be seen moving against the blue. They looked like tiny, purposeful ants on a giant's shoulder. And then, with a motion as graceful as a bird taking flight, a splash of color unfurled. The red, white, and blue did not just appear, it seemed to bloom. Against the endless charcoal and slate of the mountain, the colors were so vivid they looked like a miracle. For Silas, the sight was a physical sensation, a sudden warmth that started in his chest and moved outward to his fingertips, chasing away the damp chill of the volcanic ash. It was as if a window had been opened in a dark room, letting in the first light of a spring morning. He didn't shout. He didn't cheer. He simply exhaled a long, shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a collective sigh of hope that seemed to ripple across the entire beach, passed from man to man like a silent blessing. In that moment, the island of Iwo Jima changed. It was no longer just a place of struggle and shadow, it had become a place where the world could see itself again. Silas watched as a man nearby, a rugged sergeant who had spent the last 3 days speaking only in gruff commands, slowly removed his helmet and wiped a stray tear from his cheek with a grimy sleeve. There was no shame in that moisture, only a profound, shared relief. They weren't looking at a piece of fabric, they were looking at a letter from home written in the wind. They were looking at the promise of a Sunday afternoon, the memory of a high school graduation, and the hope of a world where the only thing that flapped in the breeze was the laundry on a backyard line. The ships anchored offshore began to find their own voice. From the deep, metallic hearts of the great vessels, the whistles began to blow, low, vibrating hums that echoed across the water and bounced off the stone walls of the mountain. It was a symphony of recognition, a chorus of steel and steam celebrating the persistence of the human spirit. To Silas, the sound felt like a hand on his shoulder, steady and strong. He looked at his friend Elias, who was standing a few feet away, his face illuminated by a soft, incredulous smile. They didn't need to speak. The bond between them, forged in the dark hours of the midnight watch, was now anchored by this shared beacon on the peak. They were no longer just survivors, they were witnesses to a quiet, towering grace. Kindness, which had lived in small, hidden corners of the foxholes, suddenly stepped out into the light. A man passed his canteen to another, not because of thirst, but as a toast to the colors above. Someone shared a precious, crumpled cigarette, the smoke rising in a thin, blue line that mimicked the flag's own journey into the sky. These tiny acts of generosity were the everyday heroism of the beach, the ways in which the men reminded each other that they were still human, still kind, and still capable of wonder. The flag on the mountain was the fire, but these moments were the warmth it cast upon the world below. As the morning moved toward afternoon, the air seemed to lose its sulphurous edge, replaced by a scent that Silas imagined was the smell of the sea reaching out to embrace the land. He sat back down in the ash, but the ground didn't feel quite so cold anymore. He reached for his pencil and a scrap of paper, his movements slow and meditative. He didn't want to write about the noise or the gray dust. He wanted to write about the light. He wrote to his mother, telling her about the way the sky looked when the color returned to it. He told her that he felt as though he could breathe again, and that for the first time in a long time, the horizon didn't feel like a wall, but like a door. The resilience of the men on the beaches was found in their ability to hold onto this feeling. The struggle for the island was not over, and the path ahead was still long and hidden in the mist, but the beacon on the peak remained. It stayed there through the wind and the rain, a constant, flickering reminder that they were part of something larger than their own fears. Silas noticed how the men would look up at the mountain throughout the day, a quick, stolen glance just to make sure the color was still there. It was a touchstone, a way of recalibrating the heart when the world grew too loud or too gray. There is a story of a young Marine who spent the hours after the flag raising carving a small, wooden replica of the mountain out of a piece of driftwood he had found on the shore. He worked with a gentle focus, smoothing the rough edges of the wood until it felt soft in his hand. When he was finished, he placed it on a small ledge he had carved into the side of his trench. It was his own private monument, a way of carrying the mountain's new meaning with him wherever he went. This was the poetry of the beach, the transformation of a place of hardship into a place of sacred memory. In the deep of the night, when the moon rose over the Pacific and turned the volcanic sand into a field of shimmering silver, Silas looked up at the silhouette of Suribachi one last time before sleep. He couldn't see the colors in the darkness, but he knew they were there. He could hear the faint, rhythmic snapping of the fabric in the high wind, a sound like a heartbeat echoing in the clouds. He felt a sense of profound peace, a realization that the light he had seen that morning was now tucked away inside him, a tiny, unquenchable flame. He wasn't afraid of the dark anymore, he had seen the beacon, and he knew that the morning would always find its way back. The collective sigh of hope that had started on the beach had become a steady, quiet strength. It was the strength of thousands of young men who had decided that even in a world of ash, there was room for color. It was the resilience of the heart to find beauty in a jagged peak and mercy in a grimy hand. Silas closed his eyes, his mind drifting back to the pine forests of Maine and the smell of the cedar shavings. He was a boy from the woods, a son of the mountains, and a Marine of the islands. He was all of those things at once, held together by the memory of a flag waving in the Pacific breeze. As we think of those men tonight, let us look for our own beacons. Let us remember that hope is not a loud or boisterous thing, but a quiet, steady light that unfurls when we need it most. Think of the black sands of Iwo Jima and the thousands of eyes looking upward, finding a reason to smile in a splash of red, white, and blue. The mountain is silent now, the gray dust has settled, and the ocean is a vast, indigo cradle rocking the world toward sleep. You are safe, you are part of a long and shimmering story, and the light on the peak is still burning, watching over you with a kind and steady glow. Sleep now, and let your dreams be filled with the soft, rhythmic snapping of a flag in the wind. Imagine the warmth of the morning sun on your face and the relief of a long-held breath finally released. The stars are watching over the islands and the oceans, the mountains are resting in the silver light of the moon, and the dawn is waiting just beyond the horizon, carrying a promise that is as certain as the tide. You are remembered, you are cherished, and the beacon is always there, leading you gently home through the quiet sanctuary of the night. The sky over the island of Okinawa did not just drop rain, it seemed to be weeping with the very weight of the world. For the young men huddled in the deep, red mud of the Shuri line, the air had become a thick tapestry of gray mist and the constant, rhythmic thrum of falling water. This was the final gateway, the last long shadow before the dawn, and it felt as though every storm the Pacific had ever known had gathered here to witness the end. They called it the rain of steel, a relentless, metallic downpour that drummed against the earth until the very soil seemed to ache, but for the Marines on the ground, the external tempest was merely a mirror to the quiet, heavy exhaustion that had settled deep within their souls. After years of moving from one sun-drenched shore to the next, the spirit had grown as saturated as the hem of a waterlogged coat, yet within that profound weariness, a tiny, flickering light of humanity refused to go out. Imagine a young man named Elias. He had grown up in the rolling, blue-misted hills of Kentucky, where the rain was a gentle visitor that made the tobacco leaves dance and the creeks hum with life. To Elias, water had always been a source of growth, a sign that the world was renewing itself. But here, on this jagged island at the edge of the sea, the rain felt like a burden. It sat in the creases of his uniform, it turned his letters into soft, illegible pulp, and it made the simple act of taking a breath feel like a labor of the heart. Elias sat in a shallow trench that had become a small, private river, his back against the cold, wet clay. He was tired in a way that sleep could no longer reach. It was a fatigue that lived in the marrow of his bones and the quiet corners of his mind, a realization that he had traveled a lifetime in just a few short years, and his legs were finally asking him how much further the horizon could possibly be. In the middle of this gray, watery world, the steel rain was a constant background music. It was the low, vibrating hum of the distant heavy metal, a sound that didn't feel like a threat so much as a permanent part of the atmosphere, like the wind or the tide. Elias watched the way the raindrops hit a discarded metal Circassian tin, the rhythmic ping, ping, ping creating a tiny, metallic lullaby. He found himself mesmerized by the small circles the rain made in the dark puddles at his feet. In the absolute intensity of the campaign, he had found a strange, meditative sanctuary in the very things that sought to overwhelm him. He wasn't thinking about the maps or the grand designs of history, he was thinking about the way the light caught the edge of a raindrop, turning it into a single, brilliant diamond before it vanished into the mud. Beside him sat a friend named Gabe, a boy from the sun-baked streets of Los Angeles who had never seen so much water in all his life. Gabe was holding a small, crumpled photograph of his mother standing in her garden, her hand shaded over her eyes as she looked toward the camera. The edges of the photo were soft and beginning to fray from the dampness, but to Gabe, it was the only dry thing left in the world. He kept it tucked inside a piece of waterproof film, pulling it out only when the silence between the storms became too heavy to bear. Elias watched as Gabe traced the outline of his mother's face with a muddy finger, his movements slow and full of a profound, whispered tenderness. There was no talk of bravery or duty in that moment. There was only the quiet resilience of a son remembering the smell of a home-cooked meal and the sound of a voice that didn't know the language of steel. The everyday heroism of Okinawa was found in the small, shared miseries and the even smaller acts of mercy. It was the way a Marine would hold a poncho over a friend so he could try to light a damp cigarette. It was the way they shared the last of the dry coffee, the bitter, dark liquid feeling like a warm prayer in the back of the throat. Elias remembered a night when the wind was particularly cold, whipping the rain into a frenzy that felt like needles against the skin. A boy in the next hole, a newcomer who hadn't yet learned how to build a wall against the fear, began to shiver with a violence that shook his whole frame. Without a word, a seasoned sergeant crawled through the mire, wrapped his own spare blanket around the boy's shoulders, and sat with him in the dark, whispering stories about the best fishing spots in Minnesota until the boy's breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. That sergeant didn't have a blanket for himself that night, but he had something better, the knowledge that he had kept a soul from freezing in the dark. The internal exhaustion of the soul was a landscape as vast as the island itself. After so many islands, so many beaches, and so many midnights on watch, the mind began to drift. Elias found that he could no longer remember the exact shade of his bedroom walls or the sound of the bell on the courthouse square. His memories were becoming like the island, monochromatic and blurred by the rain. He felt a private fear, not of the steel falling from the sky, but of the possibility that the person he had been was being washed away, layer by layer, until there would be nothing left but the green of his uniform. But then, he would see a small, determined flower blooming in the middle of a churned-up field, its yellow petals bright against the red clay, and he would realize that if something so fragile could survive the rain of steel, then perhaps he could too. There was a profound, weary kindness that extended even to the civilians who found themselves caught in the storm. Elias remembered coming across a small group of islanders, an old man and 2 children, huddled in the shadow of a limestone cave. They were shivering, their eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. One of the Marines in Elias's squad, a man known for his toughness and his sharp tongue, stopped in his tracks. He reached into his pack and pulled out his last bar of tropical chocolate, breaking it into small pieces and handing it to the children with a smile that was so gentle it seemed to belong to another world. He sat with them for a few minutes, making a small paper bird out of a discarded wrapper. For a brief window of time, the rain of steel was forgotten. There was only the soldier, the children, and the small paper bird, a tiny messenger of peace in a land of shadows. As the campaign reached its final, heavy crescendo, the exhaustion began to turn into a strange kind of clarity. The men moved with a rhythmic, automatic grace, their bodies knowing what to do even when their minds were miles away. They were travelers at the end of a very long road, looking for the light at the end of the tunnel. Elias sat on a ridge overlooking the Shuri mud, watching the evening mist roll in from the sea. The rain had softened into a fine, silver drizzle that hung in the air like a veil. He felt a sudden, sharp connection to every man who had ever stood on a lonely hill and waited for the morning. He wasn't just a Marine, he was a sentry for the human spirit, a witness to the fact that even in the greatest storm, the heart finds a way to keep its beat. The letters that were written during those long, wet weeks were different from the ones sent from the earlier islands. They were shorter, more honest, and filled with a quiet, poetic longing. Elias wrote to his father, his pencil moving slowly over the damp paper. He didn't write about the movement of the lines or the intensity of the struggle. He wrote about the mud. He wrote about the way the red clay looked like the earth back in the tobacco fields after a spring flood. He told his father that he finally understood what it meant to be tired, and that he finally understood what it meant to be grateful for a dry pair of socks. He signed it with a hand that trembled just a little, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the love he was trying to send across the sea. Those letters were the true rain of the islands, a downpour of memory and hope that sought to wash away the bitterness of the steel. In the deep of the night, when the only sound was the rhythmic sighing of the Pacific and the occasional, distant rumble of the clouds, the exhaustion of the soul would settle into a heavy, dreamless sleep. Elias would lie in his hole, his head resting on his pack, and feel the island breathing beneath him. He felt the layers of history, the ancient stone, the red earth, and the lives that had been lived and lost in this place. He realized that he was part of the soil now, woven into the fabric of Okinawa by the very rain that had tried to break him. He wasn't a stranger anymore, he was a son of the storm. And as he closed his eyes, he could almost hear the voices of the ones who had gone before him, whispering that the end was near, and that the dawn would be the softest thing he had ever known. Everyday heroism was the man who woke his friend gently for his turn on watch, rather than shaking him. It was the man who carried an extra canteen for someone else, even when his own shoulders ached. It was the quiet resilience of a group of boys who had become men in the furnace of the Pacific, and who were now, in the final reign, becoming something even more, guardians of a shared humanity. They were the architects of a quiet endurance, building a bridge of kindness over a river of steel. As we think of those men tonight, let us remember the weight of the rain and the heaviness of the soul. Let us think of the red mud of Okinawa and the thousands of young men who sat in it, holding onto the memory of a garden or a porch or a paper bird. The storm has passed now, the steel has turned to rust, and the island is once again a place of green hills and quiet shores. But the memory of that final, intense struggle remains, a reminder that the human heart is a vessel that can carry a great deal of water without sinking. Sleep now, and let the sound of the rain against your own roof be a comfort. Imagine the silver mist of the islands and the soft, rhythmic breathing of a world at peace. Think of the light that lived in the foxholes, the shared chocolate, the whispered stories, and the fraying photographs. The stars are watching over the Pacific, the red clay is resting beneath the moon, and the dawn is waiting just beyond the horizon, carrying a light that is clear, dry, and infinitely kind. You are safe, you are part of a story that ended in hope, and the rain is only a lullaby, washing the world clean for a new day. In the heart of the Shuri mud, where the earth had turned to a river of crimson silk, the greatest victories were not found in the taking of hills, but in the steadying of a trembling hand. For weeks, the island of Okinawa had been a world of gray mist and the relentless, rhythmic drumming of the rain. The ground beneath the feet of the young Marines was no longer solid, it was a deep, shifting tide of red clay that clung to their boots and their spirits with equal weight. In this place, the city of Shuri, with its ancient walls and storied past, had been reduced to a landscape of broken tiles and shattered timber. Yet, it was here, amidst the ruins of what once was a kingdom, that a different kind of garden began to bloom, not of flowers or vines, but of an unexpected and profound compassion that reached across the divide of language and fear to touch the very soul of humanity. Imagine a young Marine named Thomas. He had grown up in a small town in Ohio, where the summers were filled with the scent of mown grass and the sound of screen doors snapping shut in the evening breeze. To Thomas, the world was a place of clear boundaries and familiar faces. But the Shuri mud had a way of blurring everything. As he sat in a shallow hollow beneath the jagged remains of a stone wall, his face smeared with the red earth, he felt as though he were dissolving into the landscape. He was tired in a way that sleep could not fix, a weariness that lived in the quiet spaces between his heartbeats. The rain fell in a soft, silver curtain, washing the dust from the stones and turning the ruins into a ghostly, monochromatic dream. In the quiet of a late afternoon, during a pause in the heavy weather, Thomas heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the rain. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching, like a small animal burrowing in the debris. He moved toward the sound, his movements slow and deliberate in the thick mud. Behind a pile of broken roofing tiles, he found a small, dark opening leading into what had once been a family cellar. Inside, huddled in the shadows, were an elderly woman and a small boy, perhaps no older than 5. Their eyes were wide, reflecting a terror so absolute it seemed to have drained the color from their faces. They were the broken of Shuri, the civilians caught in the gears of a world they did not choose. Thomas stood there for a long moment, the water dripping from the brim of his helmet. He was a soldier, trained for the movement of lines and the duty of the day, but in the presence of that shivering boy, the uniform felt like a costume that no longer fit. He thought of his own younger brother back in Ohio, the way he would hide under the kitchen table during summer thunderstorms. Without a word, Thomas reached into his pack. He didn't pull out a map or a tool of his trade. He pulled out a small, sealed tin of crackers and a single, precious bar of tropical chocolate that he had been saving for a day when he felt he could no longer keep going. He knelt in the mud, his knees sinking deep into the red clay, and held the chocolate out toward the boy. The elderly woman watched him with a steady, unblinking gaze, her hands protectively draped over the child's shoulders. There was a profound, heavy silence in that cellar, a space where the noise of the world could not enter. Slowly, with a hand that trembled like a leaf in the wind, the boy reached out. When his small fingers touched the foil wrapper, a tiny spark of something, hope, perhaps, or simple recognition, flickered in his eyes. Thomas smiled, a slow, gentle expression that felt strange on a face that had grown accustomed to the hardness of the islands. In that moment, the other vanished. There was only a man and a child, two souls finding a brief sanctuary in a piece of shared sweetness. This was the everyday heroism that defined the final days in the Shuri mud. It was the gardens of the broken, these small patches of mercy that Marines like Thomas cultivated in the most inhospitable soil. All across the island, similar stories were unfolding in the shadows of the tombs and the ruins of the villages. Marines who had spent months in the furnace of the Pacific were finding that their hearts had not turned to stone. They were carrying elderly grandfathers across the swollen streams, their strong arms providing a bridge of safety. They were sharing their limited water with thirsty mothers, the metal canteens passed back and forth like sacred vessels. They were using their own dry blankets to wrap shivering children, sitting with them in the dark and whispering nonsense words of comfort that needed no translation. Thomas stayed near the cellar for the rest of that day, acting as a silent sentry for the family hidden within. He watched the way the light changed as the sun struggled to break through the clouds, turning the red mud into a landscape of burnished copper. He thought about the letters he had received from his mother, how she always wrote about the roses she tended in the backyard. She called them her quiet joy, a place where she could go to forget the worries of the world. Thomas realized that he was tending his own garden now. He was protecting a small, fragile life, and in doing so, he was protecting the part of himself that still remembered how to be kind. He felt a quiet resilience taking root in his chest, a strength that was not about the power of the hand, but the endurance of the spirit to remain soft in a world that had grown hard. The shared humanity found in the mud was a testament to the fact that the human spirit is a stubborn thing. It refuses to be erased by the rain or buried by the debris. Thomas watched as a friend of his, a rugged man from the docks of Boston named Mike, sat on a fallen beam and shared his lunch with an Okinawan man who had lost everything but the clothes on his back. They sat side by side, their shoulders touching, two men from different sides of the globe joined by the simple, universal language of hunger and companionship. They didn't talk about the struggle or the politics, they talked with their hands, showing pictures of their families and pointing toward the horizon where the sun was finally beginning to set. In the ruins of Shuri, the walls had fallen, but the bridges were being built. As the night began to fall, the air grew cool and the scent of the wet earth became even more intense. It was the smell of beginning and end, of life and decay held in a delicate balance. Thomas looked into the cellar one last time before he had to move on. The boy was asleep, his head resting in the woman's lap, the empty chocolate wrapper tucked under his hand like a treasure. The woman looked up at Thomas and gave a small, slow nod, a gesture of profound respect and a recognition of the promise he had kept. Thomas felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known since the Sunday mornings of his youth. He realized that even in the middle of a storm, a person can find a way to be a lighthouse. The gardens of the broken were not permanent structures. They were moments in time, flickers of light in a long darkness. But for the men who planted them and the people who received them, they were everything. They were the proof that the world could be put back together, one small act of kindness at a time. As Thomas walked back through the red mud, his boots heavy and his bones aching, he felt lighter in his soul. He carried the image of the sleeping boy with him, a tiny, glowing coal that he would use to warm his heart during the long watches ahead. He was no longer just a Marine in a theater of war, he was a gardener of the human spirit, a witness to the beauty that survives when everything else is gone. In the deep of the night, when the only sound was the rhythmic sighing of the Pacific and the distant, hollow echo of a falling stone, the memory of those moments of compassion would settle over the camp like a soft, protective mist. The men would lie in their holes, their eyes closed, and think not of the hills they had taken, but of the hands they had held. They would remember the children's laughter and the silent gratitude of the elders. They were finding that the greatest resilience of all was the ability to forgive the world for its harshness and to offer it a small piece of chocolate in return. Everyday heroism was the man who gave up his last dry pair of socks to a civilian whose feet were raw from the journey. It was the sergeant who spoke in a whisper to a frightened family, his voice a gentle lullaby in the dark. It was the quiet, steady courage to look into the eyes of the enemy and see a neighbor, a father, a child. They were the architects of a new kind of peace, a peace that was being written in the Shuri mud before the papers were ever signed. They were learning that the heart is a vessel that can hold a great deal of sorrow, but it can also hold an infinite amount of grace. As we think of those men tonight, let us remember the gardens they planted in the ruins. Let us think of the red clay of Okinawa and the way it was softened by the tears and the kindness of those who walked upon it. The city of Shuri has been rebuilt, the walls are standing again, and the gardens of the island are filled with the scent of lilies and jasmine. But the memory of that other garden, the garden of the broken, remains, carved into the very stone of the island and the hearts of those who were there. Sleep now, and let the peace of that shared humanity wash over you. Imagine the soft, silver rain falling on the broken stones, washing away the dust of the day. Think of the light that lived in the cellars and the tombs, the shared crackers, the whispered stories, and the tiny paper birds. The stars are watching over the Pacific, the red earth is resting beneath the moon, and the dawn is waiting just beyond the horizon, carrying a light that is clear, warm, and infinitely kind. You are safe, you are part of a story that found its way back to grace, and the world is a garden that is always waiting to bloom, if only we have the courage to plant the first seed. The world did not end with a roar, but with a silence so absolute it felt as though the very heart of the earth had skipped a beat. For years, the young men of the Marine Corps had lived in a world defined by a relentless, crushing weight of sound, the hum of engines, the rhythmic thrum of the tide, and the sharp, sudden punctuations of a life lived on the edge of the horizon. But then, on a morning that looked exactly like every other tropical morning, the noise simply vanished. It was a day when the sun rose over the Pacific and found a world that had forgotten how to be still. For the men standing on the decks of the great ships or sitting in the cooling mud of the islands, this was the silence of the sun, a strange, hollow, and beautiful stillness that signaled the end of one journey and the terrifying, wonderful beginning of another. It was a moment where the world, bruised and breathless, began to remember how to simply exist. Imagine a young man named Nathan. He is 22 years old, though in the quiet of this new morning, he feels as though he has lived a century. Nathan is sitting on the edge of a pier, his boots dangling over the clear, turquoise water. In his hand, he holds a small, metal mirror, the kind he has used for years to shave in the dark or catch the light of a signal. He looks at his reflection, really looks at it, for the first time since the Sunday morning in December that changed everything. He sees the lines around his eyes, the weathering of his skin by salt and sun, and a certain stillness in his gaze that wasn't there before. He realizes that the war has not just been something he did, it was something that became him. And now, as the sun warms his shoulders with a gentle, uncomplicated heat, he wonders who is left underneath the green fabric of his uniform. The silence was not an empty thing, it was heavy and resonant, like the air in a great cathedral after the choir has finished its song. For Nathan and his brothers, the lack of orders, the lack of a destination, was almost physically jarring. For so long, every minute had been a movement toward a goal, a survival of the next hour. Now, time had suddenly stretched out before them like a vast, calm sea with no shore in sight. Nathan watched a small, colorful bird land on the rusted barrel of an abandoned piece of machinery nearby. The bird didn't know the war was over, it only knew the sun was warm and the world was quiet. It began to sing a tiny, melodic song, a sound so delicate and normal that it brought a lump to Nathan's throat. It was the sound of a world that was already moving on, a world that was reclaiming the spaces where the shadows had lived. In the barracks and on the ships, the everyday heroism of the transition began to take place. It was the heroism of choosing to be a person again. Nathan watched as his friend, a rugged boy named Sam from the timber woods of Oregon, began to carefully pack his belongings. Sam didn't have much, a few letters, a lucky stone, a tattered book of poetry. but he handled each item as if it were a sacred relic. He was folding his spare clothes with a rhythmic, meditative grace, his large, calloused hands moving softly over the fabric. This was the quiet resilience of the spirit, the decision to return to the small, domestic habits of peace. They were learning to speak in normal voices again, no longer needing to shout over the wind or whisper in the dark. The conversations were about the simple things, the taste of a fresh peach, the feel of a real mattress, the sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday afternoon. The silence of the sun was also a time of profound, private reflection. Away from the shared noise of the group, each man was left alone with his own heart. Nathan found himself thinking about the letters he had written and the ones he had received. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the very last letter from his mother. It was stained with salt and creased from being read 100 times. She wrote about the garden, about how the roses were particularly bright this year, and how she had kept his room exactly the same, waiting for the day he would walk back through the door. As he read the words in the quiet of the morning, they felt different. They were no longer a lifeline to a distant world, they were a map. He was actually going to see those roses. He was actually going to sleep in that room. The realization was so sharp and so sweet it made his chest ache. But within the relief, there was a hollow feeling, a space where the fear and the purpose used to be. For years, the Marines had lived with a constant, humming anxiety, a survival instinct that had kept them moving. Now that the danger was gone, the silence felt a little bit lonely. Nathan looked at the men around him, his family of the islands, and saw the same look in their eyes. They were all trying to remember how to breathe without a weight on their chests. They were like divers who had come up from the depths too quickly, feeling the strange pressure of the light. They found comfort in the silence of each other's company. They would sit for hours on the decks, watching the sunset, not saying a word. They didn't need to. The shared silence was a conversation in itself, an acknowledgement of everything they had seen and everything they were leaving behind. Kindness during this time of stillness was a soft and pervasive thing. It was the way a cook would give an extra scoop of peaches to a boy who looked a little too lost in his own thoughts. It was the way a sergeant would put a hand on a private's shoulder and tell him, "You did good, kid. You're going home." It was the way they shared their last treasures, a bar of chocolate, a rare cigarette, a scrap of paper, knowing that soon, these things would be mundane again. They were treating each other with a fragile, almost desperate gentleness, as if they were all made of glass. They were the broken who were beginning to mend, and they were doing it by holding onto one another in the quiet. The landscape of the islands began to change under the silence of the sun. Without the movement of men and machines, the jungle began its slow, relentless reclamation. Vines began to curl around the abandoned trucks, the rain began to smooth over the edges of the foxholes, the sand began to fill in the footprints on the beaches. Nathan walked along the shore of the island where he had spent the last month, and he noticed how the earth seemed to be exhaling. The scent of sulfur and diesel was being washed away by the salt spray and the smell of blooming jasmine. The island was becoming a garden again. He realized that nature has no memory of war, it only knows the cycle of the seasons and the warmth of the light. There was a profound comfort in that indifference. It meant that the world was capable of healing itself, and if the island could heal, then perhaps he could too. There is a story of a Marine who, on the night the peace was announced, went down to the water's edge with a box of flares. He didn't fire them into the sky as a celebration. Instead, he opened them one by one and let the colored light spill out onto the sand, creating a small, glowing garden of red, green, and white. He sat there in the middle of the light, just watching the colors fade into the dark. It was a private ceremony, a way of saying goodbye to the fire and hello to the night. He was turning the tools of war into a moment of beauty, a small act of poetic defiance against the shadows. Nathan thought of that story often in the days that followed. He realized that they were all doing some version of that, taking the fragments of their lives and trying to arrange them into something that looked like peace. The letters home during this time were the most difficult to write. How do you tell someone that you are coming back, but that you are not the same person who left? Nathan sat with his pen and paper, the sun warm on his neck, and tried to find the words. He didn't write about the struggle or the islands. He wrote about the silence. He told his mother that he had forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid, and that he was looking forward to learning how to be a son again. He told her he missed the sound of the rain on the tin roof of the porch, and that he wanted to spend a whole day just sitting under the old oak tree. He was building a bridge of words back to the person he used to be, hoping that the person he was now would be welcome on the other side. As the ships finally began to turn their bows toward the east, toward the rising sun and the long voyage home, a sense of solemnity settled over the fleet. The silence of the sun was being replaced by the rhythmic thrum of the homeward journey, but it was a different kind of sound. It was the sound of a heartbeat returning to its normal pace. Nathan stood at the railing, watching the island shrink into small green smudges on the horizon. He felt a deep, resonant gratitude for the silence. It had given him the space to find his breath. It had given him the time to look at his hands and see them as his own again. He was carrying the silence with him, a quiet, internal sanctuary that he would keep for the rest of his life. The everyday heroism of the end was the courage to look forward. It was the resilience to believe in a future that didn't involve a watch or a perimeter. Nathan looked at the horizon and saw not a threat, but a promise. He saw the vast, blue potential of a world at peace. He thought of the thousands of young men who were all looking at that same horizon, all of them carriers of the same quiet legacy. They were the architects of a new world, a world that was being born in the silence of the Pacific sun. As we think of those men tonight, let us remember the stillness that followed the storm. Let us think of the quiet beaches, the rusting steel becoming part of the coral, and the thousands of letters that simply said, "I'm coming home." The war is a memory now, a shadow in the distance, but the silence remains, a reminder of the peace that was bought with the strength of the human spirit. The sun has set on that chapter of history, leaving a world that is soft, quiet, and trying to remember how to breathe. Sleep now, and let the silence be your blanket. Imagine the calm, silver waters of the Pacific, the warmth of the sun on a quiet pier, and the sound of a single bird singing in the morning light. The stars are watching over the ships and the shores, the jungle is whispering its ancient secrets to the wind, and the dawn is waiting just beyond the horizon, carrying a light that is clear, certain, and infinitely kind. You are safe, you are part of a story that found its way to the quiet, and the world is holding its breath, waiting for the beauty of a new day to begin. The ocean is a bridge that remembers every footstep, but tonight, it is only a cradle rocking the weary toward a shore they once thought lived only in dreams. On the long, silver journey eastward across the Pacific, the world has become a vast, rhythmic expanse of blue and gold. The great ships, once heavy with the machinery of a global struggle, now sit a little lighter on the swells, carrying a cargo far more precious than steel, the beating hearts of young men who are finally, quietly, heading home. For the Marines standing at the railings, watching the white wake stretch out behind them like a long, fading ribbon of memory, the horizon is no longer a line of peril. It has become a soft embrace, a gentle promise that the world is ready to take them back into its arms. Imagine a Marine named David. He is 23 years old, but as he leans against the cool metal of the ship's side, he feels the weight of 1,000 years in his shoulders. David has spent the last few years moving from one island to the next, names that used to be just spots on a map, now etched into his soul with the texture of sand, the scent of jungle rain, and the heat of volcanic ash. But as the ship hums beneath his feet, those places are beginning to soften. They are receding into the mist of the past, becoming a series of quiet, internal galleries he will visit only in the stillness of the night. He looks out at the water, which is so calm it looks like a sheet of silk, and he realizes that the greatest journey was never the one across the islands. It was the journey back to the person he used to be. The voyage home is a time of profound, hushed transition. It is a slow exhaling of a breath that has been held for years. In the berths below and on the sun-drenched decks above, the silence is different now. It is not the jagged, expectant silence of the midnight watch, but a smooth, peaceful quiet, like the air in a library or a sleeping house. David watches his brothers, men who have walked through the rain of steel and the cave of lost echoes, as they sit in small groups, sharing the last of their shipboard coffee. They are no longer talking about the next beach or the next ridge. They are talking about the shape of their mother's kitchens, the color of their first cars, and the way the light hits the local park on a Sunday morning. They are rebuilding their lives with words, piece by delicate piece, and the safety of the open sea. David reaches into his sea bag and pulls out a small bundle of letters, tied together with a piece of frayed twine. He doesn't need to read them. He knows every curve of the ink and every smudge of the thumbprints on the envelopes. These letters were his bread and his water during the long, thirsty days of the Umberbergal and the Shuri mud. As he holds them now, the paper feels soft and familiar, a tangible connection to the world he is about to re-enter. He thinks of the person who wrote them, his wife, Sarah, and he wonders if she can feel the ship moving closer. He wonders if his dog still remembers the sound of his whistle, and if the old oak tree in the front yard has grown much since he's been gone. These are the gentle anxieties of a heart that is learning how to hope again. The quiet legacy of the Marine Corps is not found in the grand monuments of stone, but in the small, invisible changes in the men themselves. David notices it in the way his friend Peter, a man who once spent his days in the timber woods, now moves with a careful, deliberate grace. It is in the way they look at one another, a gaze that holds a lifetime of shared secrets and unspoken understandings. They carry a legacy of kindness, born in the moments when they shared their last drop of water or held a poncho over a shivering comrade. They carry a legacy of resilience, the knowledge that they can endure the unendurable and still find a reason to smile at a flickering light in the grass. This is the quiet treasure they are bringing back to the front porches of America, a deep, resonant compassion for the fragility of life. At night, the Pacific becomes a cathedral of stars. As the ship crosses the invisible lines of the world, the constellations begin to shift. The Southern Cross, which had been a constant companion in the dark hours of the islands, begins to dip lower toward the horizon, while the North Star rises higher, a steady, silver beacon leading them toward the familiar. David lies on the deck, looking up at the velvet sky, and feels a sense of profound peace. He realizes that he is no longer a sentry for a perimeter, he is a passenger on a turning earth. The fear that once lived in the pit of his stomach has dissolved into the salt air, replaced by a quiet awe for the vastness and the beauty of the universe. He is a small, living spark in a great story, and for the first time in a long time, he feels safe. Everyday heroism on the homeward voyage is found in the way the men care for one another's spirits. It is the way a sergeant sits with a young private who is afraid that his family won't recognize the man he has become. It is the way they share their memories of the friends who are not on the ship, speaking their names softly into the wind so they are not forgotten. They are the guardians of a shared grief, a collective weight that they carry together so that no one man has to bear it alone. They are learning that strength is not just about standing firm, it is about being soft enough to grieve and brave enough to love. As the days pass and the air begins to turn cooler, the scent of the sea changes. It loses its tropical, spice-laden edge and takes on the crisp, sharp scent of the north. David stands at the bow, his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the first smudge of land. He thinks of the gardens of the broken and the fireflies in the dark, and he realizes that he is bringing those islands home with him. They are part of his landscape now, the dark valleys and the sun-drenched peaks of his own character. He is not the boy who left the farm. He is a man who has seen the world at its most harsh and its most beautiful, and who has chosen to believe in the beautiful. The first sight of the coastline is not greeted with a shout, but with a sudden, overwhelming hush. As the gray-blue hills of the mainland emerge from the mist, the men on the deck stand perfectly still, their breath catching in their chests. It is a moment of profound, sacred realization. They have made it. The horizon has finally reached out and touched the land. David watches as the ship passes under a great bridge, its red towers glowing in the morning sun. He sees the cars moving on the roads, the smoke rising from the chimneys, and the simple, everyday bustle of a world at peace. It looks like a painting come to life, a dream that has finally decided to stay. The arrival at the pier is a symphony of small, precious moments. David sees the crowds, a sea of waving hands and colorful dresses, but his eyes search for one face. When he finally finds her, standing near the edge of the dock with a handkerchief pressed to her lips, the world narrows down to a single point of light. He realizes that the voyage is not truly over until his hand touches hers. He feels a sudden, sharp pang of gratitude for every long night and every muddy trail, because they all led to this very second. He is a Marine, a survivor, a storyteller, but most of all, he is a man who has come home. The quiet legacy of the Corps will follow these men as they walk down the gangplank and back into their lives. They will bring it to the factories and the farms, the schools and the offices. It will be in the way they quiet a crying child, the way they help a neighbor mend a fence, and the way they stand in silence on a Sunday morning, looking at the sun on the grass. They are the architects of a new kind of peace, a peace built on the endurance of the heart and the memory of a shared burden. They will be the ones who know that a dry pair of socks is a blessing, that a shared canteen is a sacrament, and that the horizon is always worth reaching for. As we reach the end of this long, narrated journey, let us sit with the silence of the sun and the soft embrace of the horizon. Let us remember the 19 acts of a story that began in a Sunday morning peace and ended in a homeward-bound grace. The islands are at rest, the steel has returned to the earth, and the men who walked those paths are now the elders of our memory, the quiet giants of our history. They have taught us that the human spirit is a lighthouse that can weather any storm, and that kindness is the only thing that survives the dark. Sleep now, and imagine the soft, rhythmic thrum of a ship moving through the Pacific night. Feel the coolness of the salt air and the warmth of a letter tucked against your heart. Think of the stars as they shift in the sky, guiding you toward the places and the people you love. The voyage is almost over, the shore is waiting, and the morning will find you exactly where you are meant to be. You are safe, you are part of a long and shimmering legacy, and the world is holding its breath in a final, gentle lullaby. Rest in the quiet sanctuary of the horizon's soft embrace. The journey is done, the promise is kept, and the light of home is burning brightly in the window, waiting to welcome you back. Good night, and may your dreams be as calm and as deep as the sea that carried the brave boys home.